Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Maria, and I'm 25 years old. For several years, I sold basket tacos in the mornings and evenings. I'd start in the morning at the farmer's market, finish around 11 in the morning. Then in the evenings, I'd leave my house at 5 and go around to various places. I'd return home on my bicycle with whatever little I had left. That night it was about 10 minutes to 10. It was already dark, obviously, though the street lamps were still working. I was alone on my bicycle, pedaling. I was going down a wide street, but empty, well lit. That's when I heard fast footsteps, like someone was running behind me, heavy footsteps on the pavement. My first instinct was to move to one side without looking back, in case someone wanted to pass. I thought it was some kid in a hurry or someone jogging. But nobody passed me. Those footsteps kept following at the same distance behind me. I got nervous. I didn't want to turn around because of the potholes, but it was impossible to ignore. So I turned quickly, but the street was empty. The street was completely empty, not a soul. But the footsteps were still there behind me, clear footsteps running. It wasn't my imagination, I swear. It was at that moment, while I was trying not to panic, that I heard something else. A big dog suddenly got up from where it was lying and started barking like crazy. I thought it was going to try to bite me, but it ignored me completely. It didn't bark at me. It was barking furiously at nothing, toward the exact space behind me where I was hearing the footsteps running. I felt a chill run down my spine like ice water. I didn't stop. I pedaled with all my strength. I didn't look back, but that dog kept barking at those invisible footsteps. I didn't want to know if something was following me. I just remember the dog barking nonstop while I rode away. I think that little dog protected me that night from that invisible thing. That night I thought about many things. What if it was a lost soul? And what if it wanted to take me away, or things like that? Since then, I've been very grateful. Every time I pass that street, I leave food for that little dog. Sometimes he comes over, sometimes he just looks at me. But I know he saw what I couldn't see that night. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Raymond, and it's been almost a year since I asked to switch shifts at work. My colleagues at the security post thought it was crazy. They said I would rot working overnight, that the night messes with your head, but for me it was the opposite. It was my salvation. A shopping mall after the last steel door comes down, with that metallic sound becomes a world apart. And it was in that world that I needed to live. When you end a 6-year relationship, your own house starts to expel you. It's strange to say this, I know, but it's the truth. Every corner has a memory. Every object seems like an accusation. The silence in my apartment was a heavy thing, full of unspoken words and the presence of someone who was no longer there. Here at the mall, no. The midnight silence is clean, empty. It's a silence that rests the mind. My rounds were almost a ritual. I always started on the ground floor, near the food court. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in a way that made the place seem like a huge, empty church. The dark stores with mannequins and furniture behind the glass never scared me. On the contrary, they gave me a sense of order, as if the world outside, with all its mess, was finally on pause. I felt like the guardian of that particular universe. From time to time, I crossed paths with the cleaning crew, a duo that was always with a cart and that machine that washes and dries the floor. We'd exchange a quick word, a "Hey, everything okay?" And sometimes I'd accept a cup of strong coffee they brought in a thermos. The smell of eucalyptus cleaning product mixed with coffee aroma was for me the smell of peace. It was methodical work, without surprises, checking doors, checking service corridors, confirming that the alarms were all active. A routine that repeated night after night, and it was exactly that predictability I was looking for. I wanted a life without surprises. I thought that there, in that quiet giant, I would be safe from anything. This peaceful routine lasted about 4 or 5 months, enough time for me to convince myself that I had found my balance again. Predictability was my medicine, until one Tuesday night, the routine broke. I was on the second floor in the West Wing, a quieter part of the mall, where there were some furniture and decoration stores. I had just passed through a corridor that ended in a false wall, a white partition with a large "Coming Soon" painted in the middle. It had been like that since I started working there. But that night, the partition was no longer there. In its place, there was a store. The facade was all black, a matte black that seemed to absorb the light from the corridors. It had no display window, just a dark glass door, and above it, the name of the place in white letters, in a style I had never seen. It wasn't a computer font. It looked like something hand-drawn, old, with some points and curves that made reading difficult. I had to get closer to understand what it said. Curiosity Workshop. My first reaction was surprise, but not fear. I thought, wow, they were fast. I hadn't heard construction noise, nor seen the coming and going of people that a renovation usually causes. I thought it must be one of those rock merchandise stores, or maybe fantasy and nerd culture things. The name fit, after all. I stopped in front of the door and tried to look inside, protecting my eyes from the corridor light with my hand. The interior was a mess, stacked cardboard boxes, some dark wooden shelves still disassembled, and tarps covering the floor. Everything was dark inside. You could barely see the back. That's when I felt it. It wasn't a shiver, nothing like that. It was something in the atmosphere, in the air. It became heavy, dense, like the air in a room that's been closed for a long time. And along with that came the clear sensation that someone was watching me from inside that darkness. I didn't see anyone, not even a shadow, but I knew. My instinct told me to get out of there, and I obeyed. I quickened my pace and continued my rounds, but the image of that black facade was etched in my head. My tranquility had just cracked. The following nights were strange. The workshop opened, but not like the other stores. During the day, they told me later, almost no one entered. But at night, on my rounds, I saw the light inside, a weak, yellowish light that barely illuminated the objects on the shelves. And I, even without wanting to, always looked. It became a kind of magnet. I tried to walk straight, focus on the corridor ahead, but my eyes deviated by themselves. I saw shelves full of jars, some with dark liquids, others with what looked like dried herbs or twisted branches. There were candles of shapes and colors I had never seen, some that looked made of dirty wax, and some little wooden boxes with symbols I didn't recognize. The decoration was heavy, dark, and seemed to suck the joy from the surrounding environment. Then came the smell. It wasn't every night. It appeared suddenly when I approached that sector. It was a sweet and rancid smell at the same time, a mixture of cheap incense with rotting flour. It was a smell that stuck to the nose and turned the stomach a little. I even thought it was some problem in the plumbing, some dead animal in the air duct. But the smell only existed there within a radius of about 20 meters from that black door. And then the sounds started, subtle things that made me doubt my own head. One night, while I was passing through the third floor, right above the store, I heard a dry bang on the metal railing downstairs, a single strong blow. I looked down immediately, but there was no one. The silence returned, dense as always. The worst was about 3 weeks ago. It was almost 3 in the morning, the quietest time of all. I was doing rounds in the same corridor as the store when I heard it. It was a moan, low, muffled, like someone in pain. It came from inside the workshop. At that moment, duty spoke louder than my apprehension. I grabbed the radio. "Central, this is Raymond. I'm on the 2nd floor, West Wing." I heard a noise that sounded like a moan coming from store 142. The answer took a second. The supervisor told me to wait and that Diego, another guard who was downstairs, would meet me. I waited with my heart beating a little faster, looking at that dark door. Diego arrived, an older guy, skeptical. We went together to the door. The silence was total. We put our ears to the glass, heard nothing. We called the tenant's emergency number, as per regulations. No one answered. After 20 minutes, the supervisor told us to abort. "Must be the pipe noise, Raymond. This building is full of tricks," he said over the radio. Diego patted me on the back and left, but I knew it wasn't the pipe. I was starting to connect the dots, and they all led to that place. I just had no idea how deep the problem went. The mall's main lights go out punctually at 10 at night, but my shift starts at 9. In that first hour, movement is already weak. It's the last customers leaving the cinema, store employees dragging the metal doors, that end-of-party atmosphere. It's a transition time, and I like to observe everything from the 2nd floor, which has a large central void with a view to the floor below. And it was down there, across the void, that the Curiosity Workshop was located. Its yellowish lights were still on. I wasn't exactly spying. It was more of a nervous habit, a way to keep the store in my field of vision while I did my rounds. That night I saw a family approach the black door, the father, mother, and a little girl. They stopped, pointed to something inside, and even pushed the glass door, but it wouldn't open. I saw a silhouette inside gesture, a quick movement that clearly meant they were already closed. The family shrugged and went on their way. Normal happens all the time. I continued my slow walk down the corridor. The sound of the metal blinds of other stores coming down echoed through the void. That's when I saw, walking in the opposite direction in the corridor on the other side, a man. He stood out from everything there. He wore dark, worn clothes, walked with hunched shoulders, and had an unshaven beard, the look of someone who hadn't slept properly for days. My first security reaction was to be alert. I thought he might be a beggar, someone who snuck in to spend the night. I kept watching, ready to grab the radio if he tried to force entry into any store. But to my total surprise, he walked straight to the curiosity workshop. He didn't try to open the door, didn't knock, just stopped in front of the dark glass and waited. A second later, the door opened for him. He entered. I couldn't see who opened it. He stayed inside for maybe 2 minutes, no more than that, and then came out carrying a small dark box, the size of a matchbox. He put the object in his pants pocket, turned his back to the store, and disappeared into a side corridor. I stood there in the same place, trying to process what I had just seen. It wasn't something from my head. It wasn't a pipe making noise. That was real. That store operated with its own rules, and those rules didn't apply to everyone. That family with the little daughter was refused. That man, with his air of desperation, was welcomed with open arms in the middle of the night. For the first time, my apprehension became certainty. There was something very wrong happening there. For a few weeks, I changed my route. I started doing the second floor rounds on the other side, as far as possible from that black facade. I didn't want to see, didn't want to feel that heavy air, didn't want to risk witnessing another scene like that. It was a cowardly solution, I know, but it was the only one that gave me some peace. But that peace, of course, didn't last. It was in early October, on a Thursday night. I was on the 3rd floor, passing by the protection railing and looking at the floor below, when I saw strange movement. It was one of the workshop employees, a very tall guy, too thin, with a somewhat sickly air. He was pushing a metal cart, one of those for transport, with about 3 cardboard boxes on top, right through the middle of the main corridor. My stomach knotted. I didn't want to go there. Everything in me told me to turn my back, pretend I didn't see. But the mall regulations are crystal clear. Cargo transport, whatever it is, only through service corridors. It's a basic safety and operation rule. Ignoring that could cost me my job. Between my fear and my need to pay bills, the second spoke louder. I went down the stopped escalator, feeling each step as if I was walking toward something bad. The closer I got, the stronger that sweet and rotten smell became. I stopped in front of the glass door. The yellowish light inside seemed sickly. I knocked twice with my knuckles. It took about 10 seconds that seemed like 10 minutes. I heard the dry click of an electronic lock, and the door opened a little. I pushed and entered. The smell was suffocating, a dense mixture of incense, dust, and something else. Something organic and rancid that I couldn't identify. There were 3 people inside. The thin guy I had seen, another girl with an expressionless face arranging some jars, and behind the counter, a woman. She must have been about 50 years old, dark hair tied in a bun, and a look so penetrating that it made me look away immediately. The 3 stopped what they were doing and stared at me in silence. I forced my voice to come out firm, professional. "Good evening. Sorry to bother, but you can't transport merchandise through the mall's public area. It has to be done through the service corridor." The woman behind the counter, who I assumed was the owner, kept her eyes fixed on me. She showed no surprise, just slight annoyance, as if I were an insect disrupting her work. "Good evening. Yes, we know. The problem is that the lock on our back door is stuck. It won't open at all." Her voice was calm, but had a tone that brooked no argument. While she spoke, my gaze quickly ran through the place. I saw things I had only glimpsed from afar. Twisted candles in a sickly yellow wax color, transparent little boxes with what looked like small bones inside, strange card decks, and a large leather-bound book open on the counter. The pages seemed handwritten in calligraphy I didn't understand. I was just going to nod and get out of there as fast as possible, but she spoke again before I could move. Her tone was cutting. "Anything else you have to tell us, Raymond?" Hearing my name in her voice gave me a lump in my throat. I tried to be rational. "Of course, it's on my badge, on the uniform lapel." It's obvious she knows my name, but the way she said it didn't sound like she had read it, like she already knew me. And my mouth went dry. The name on the badge was the logical explanation, but my instinct screamed that it wasn't just that. I tried to disguise the impact, force an air of normalcy. By a stupid impulse, an attempt to break the tension, I said the first thing that came to my head. "My father was a locksmith, taught me some things. If you want, I can take a look at the lock just to see if it's something simple." I prayed she would refuse, say she didn't need it, that they had already called someone. But to my bad luck, a wide and somewhat forced smile opened on her face. "How kind of you, excellent. Please follow me. My name is Barbara." She gestured with her head for me to follow her around the counter. As we walked toward a door in the back, she spoke in a tone that didn't match the environment at all. "We really value discretion, you know. The last thing we want is to bother neighbors or disrupt circulation." With each step I took into the store's interior, the air seemed colder and the smell of spoiled things got stronger. She opened the back door, and I entered the storage room. If the smell was bad in the store, there it was almost unbearable. It was a smell of damp basement, mold, mixed with that same sweet rancid, only 10 times stronger. The place was cramped, full of cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling. I glanced at some handwritten labels. Crossroads dust, black sheep tallow, cemetery dirt. My body seemed to get heavier. Barbara pointed me to the metal back door. "It's this one here." She handed me a rusty toolbox and stood next to me in silence while I crouched to look at the lock. The cold there was so much that I could see my own breath condensing in the air. While I examined the mechanism that seemed just stuck, I felt that pressure in the environment again. The certainty that there were more people there, not just Barbara and me. I swear by everything that's most sacred, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move in the darkness behind a pile of boxes. I turned my head at once. My heart gave a jump that hurt. There was nothing, just the shadow projected by the shelves. The fright made me lose my balance. My left hand flew to the side to support me and touched something on a low shelf covered by a dirty cloth. I felt through the fabric the shape of a wooden object with rough carvings and a cold that wasn't normal. A cold that went through the skin of my hand. I pulled my hand back as if I had touched fire. My voice came out shaky. "Is there anyone else here with us?" Barbara kept the smile on her face, a smile that now seemed predatory to me. "It's never empty here, Raymond, but stay calm. You're my guest." It took me about 5 minutes to unlock the door with sweating and trembling hands. Barbara didn't move 1 centimeter, just observed my every move. When I finally succeeded and the mechanism turned, I got up quickly, just wanting to get out of there. "Ready, solved. I knew you could do it. Thank you so much, really." I just wanted to leave, but she stood in my way, blocking the exit from the storage room. She looked me deep in the eyes. "A person does everything not to have to think, doesn't he, Raymond? The silence of the night helps with that, at least for a few hours." That hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. There was no way she could know that. It wasn't written on any badge. it was my secret. The reason I buried myself in that mall every night. The terror I felt at that moment wasn't because of the dark, the smells, or the shadows. It was the terror of being completely exposed, naked, in front of something that could see what was going on inside me. I didn't answer, just moved away from her, passed through the store like lightning, and went out to the mall corridor. The normal corridor air had never seemed so pure. I didn't finish my rounds that night. I went straight to our break room, a little room without windows in the back of the administration. I said over the radio that I wasn't feeling well, an excuse my supervisor accepted without question. My voice must have been terrible. I sat in a plastic chair under a fluorescent light that buzzed and stayed there looking at the wall. I tried to find a logical explanation for what Barbara had said. Maybe she heard some rumor, some gossip from another employee. But who? I never talked about my personal life with anyone there. The truth is there was no explanation. She simply knew. And the cold I felt when touching that object in the storage room, I still felt a remnant of it in the palm of my hand, a frozen numbness that wouldn't go away. I stayed in the room until dawn broke and my shift ended. The bus ride home was torment. Every person who looked at me for more than a second seemed suspicious. The world seemed the same as always, but I felt like an intruder in it, as if I was vibrating on a different frequency and everyone could notice. I got to my apartment and turned the key in the lock 3 times, an old habit that had never seemed so necessary. I went straight to the shower. I let the hot water fall for a long time, as if it could wash not only the dirt from my body, but the feeling of having been invaded from within. It didn't help. I lay in bed exhausted, but knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. My mind replayed the scene in the storage room, Barbara's calm voice, her smile, and that phrase that dismantled me inside. I lay there, eyes open, looking at the ceiling and watching the morning sun begin to paint the plaster orange. That's when I heard it. A low dragging sound came from the living room, as if someone was pulling heavy furniture, but very slowly, very carefully not to make noise. A sound of wood dragging on wood. I froze where I was. I live alone. There was no one there. The sound stopped. I stayed in absolute silence, holding my breath, trying to hear anything else. Nothing. Just the distant sound of traffic outside. Slowly, I got out of bed. I made no noise. I walked on tiptoe to the bedroom door that was ajar. I peeked through the crack. The living room was exactly as I had left it, empty, bathed in morning light. The chair in place, the coffee table, the sofa, everything normal. I felt immense relief and a hint of shame. I was panicking on the verge of paranoia. It was obvious that the noise had come from a neighboring apartment. Of course, that was all. I was about to go back to bed when my eyes focused on the floor, in the space between the sofa and the balcony door. There was a mark on the wooden floor, a mark that didn't exist before. It was a long, thin scratch, as if the tip of a nail or stone had been dragged hard for about 30 centimeters, digging deep into the varnish. I knew every inch of that floor, every defect, every stain. That scratch was new. It wasn't there when I left for work the night before. I stood there looking at that violent line on my floor, and the terror I felt was different from all the others. It was no longer about a strange place at my work. The thing from that store, it was no longer just there. It had followed me. It had entered my house. I didn't quit. I should have quit. Should have dropped everything. move to another city I don't know. But life isn't like in a movie. I have bills to pay, rent. A life that, however broken it may be, needs money to continue existing. So I continued at my job. I continued being the mall's night security guard. It's been 2 months since that night. My house is no longer my house. Small things happen all the time. A glass I leave in the sink and appears on the table. A cupboard door I find open when I'm sure I closed it. Sometimes when I'm in the shower, I hear a step in the hallway. It's slow torture, a constant reminder that I'll never truly be alone again. The scratch on the floor is still there. I never tried to fix it. It's part of the furniture now. Now at work, fear has transformed into a kind of dark routine. I never passed in front of the curiosity workshop again. I make a huge detour if necessary. I know the store is still there. Sometimes I smell it from afar, carried by some air current from the air conditioning. I found out that a day shift colleague was fired a month ago. He called the police because he swore he heard screams coming from inside there. They found nothing, and he was fired for false alarm. Barbara, apparently, has important friends. No one messes with her. I never spoke to the store owner again. I almost never see her. But last week our paths crossed. I was on the 3rd floor near the cinema, and she was leaving her store downstairs. It was almost 10 at night. I looked down and her gaze met mine through the immense void that separates the corridors. I expected a cold look, a silent threat, but no. Barbara saw me and a discreet smile appeared on her lips. She raised her hand and gave me a small wave, a friendly gesture, almost a good night. My body acted alone. I raised my hand and waved back, and at that moment I understood everything. It wasn't a truce, it was the leash. It was the owner confirming that his possession was still there in the right place. My mistake wasn't being curious, my mistake was being polite. It was offering help to fix a stupid lock in a gesture to disguise my own panic. By trying to fix her door, I opened mine. And now, I'm just another one of the curiosities that inhabit that mall during the night. Good evening, Dom. My name is Celia. First of all, I want to say that I'm a fan of yours. I've been following the channel for a good while, and the way the stories are told here gave me courage to finally get out something that happened to me and still happens. Actually, I don't want to reveal the name of the store or the shopping plaza where I work for obvious reasons. My manager wouldn't understand, and the last thing I need is more headache or worse, losing my job. I got this job about 2 years ago. It's one of those commercial plazas downtown, an old building with a bunch of electronic stores, one glued to the other. The place has that specific smell, you know. A mixture of dust with the kind of electric air that comes out of computer vents. I was really needing the work, so I didn't think twice. On my first day, the manager, a man about 50 years old, explained the basic things to me. How to operate the register, organize inventory, the usual. But at the end of the conversation, he stopped, looked at me in a way that was a little too serious, and said something that at the time I just thought was weird. He told me not to be scared if once in a while some light flickered or a device turned off by itself. His justification was long, full of technical details about the building's wiring being old, about power surges, about how the fuses weren't the best. I just nodded, but inside I thought it was strange for him to go to all that trouble to justify such a silly thing. It seemed like he was more trying to convince himself than convince me. But anyway, I needed the job, and it wasn't a flickering light that was going to make me change my mind. I grew up in a crowded house with 4 younger siblings. Mess and things out of place were normal for me. I just didn't imagine that the mess in that store was of another kind. The first few weeks were calm, exactly as expected. I got along well with my coworker, Yuri, a guy who had been there for about 5 good years and knew every screw in that place. We caught the rhythm, opened the store, cleaned the counters, served customers, closed the register. The manager's so-called old wiring didn't show signs of life, and I had even forgotten about that strange talk. Until one day, about 3 weeks after I started, a customer asked for a specific model of RAM memory. We didn't have it in the store, but I was almost sure I had seen some boxes in the storage room. I excused myself and went to the back. The storage room was a narrow corridor with metal shelves that went to the ceiling, loaded with cardboard boxes. A single light in the center barely and poorly illuminated the place. While I was looking on the lowest shelf, crouched on the floor, the light went out. Everything went dark suddenly. My first reaction was to huff, thinking, "Here we go," the wiring nonsense started. I got my cell phone from my pocket to turn on the flashlight, but that's when something froze me. I could still hear the background music playing in the store, the low murmur of customers up front. The power hadn't gone out. It was just there, just with me. And then, coming from some corner in the darkness, I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was almost a breath, a short little laugh from a child. That made me hold my breath right away. I turned on the phone's flashlight. The flashlight beam trembled and passed over the piles of boxes. I pointed to the back of the corridor, to the corners, but I didn't see anyone, just shelves and dust. My brain immediately looked for the most logical answer. It could only be Yuri. "Very funny, Yuri," I said, trying to make my voice come out firm, but it failed a little. Silence. A heavy silence that seemed to absorb the sound coming from the store. I pointed the light once more to the back of the corridor, and for a millisecond I saw, or think I saw, a shadow, a dark stain moving quickly behind a pile of monitor boxes. It was so fast that I doubted myself. I went back to the door, hit the switch, and the light came on immediately. I pretended nothing had happened. I grabbed the first box I saw and got out of there, feeling the air a little colder on my back. I finished serving the customer on autopilot, my head still replaying the scene in the storage room. The laugh, the shadow. No, it could only be a bad taste joke. As soon as the customer left, I went straight to Yuri, who was at the counter, dusting some headphone boxes. I was more irritated than scared, actually. "Look, I know it was you," I started, crossing my arms. "You didn't need all that there in the storage room, okay? It wasn't funny." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me, blinking slowly, as if I was speaking Greek. There wasn't a hint of laughter or guilt on his face. It was just tiredness. "What are you talking about, Celia?" His calmness disarmed me. I explained everything. The light that went out by itself, the little laugh, the shadow. With each word of mine, his expression continued the same, without reaction. He just listened, nodding slowly. When I finished, he gave a long sigh, picked up the cloth and went back to cleaning the box, as if I had just commented on the weather. "Ah," he said with a low voice. "So you've already met the kid?" I stood there, not understanding. "Kid? What kid? What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged without even looking at me. "There's a boy there," He was already here when I came in. Likes to make trouble, turns off lights, unplugs TVs, those things. But that's all. He doesn't do anything major. That hit me in a dry way. The naturalness with which he spoke, that disconnected way of his, was much scarier than any ghost. I was expecting him to laugh, to confess the joke, but no, he was serious. You're being serious." My voice was almost a whisper. "Of course," he replied, finally looking at me. There was a kind of pity in his look. "The manager gave you that talk about wiring, didn't he? That's what he tells everyone. It's easier. Look, the best thing you do is ignore. You'll get used to it eventually." He turned and continued working, ending the subject. And I stood there in the middle of the store, feeling a strange emptiness in my stomach. Get used to it. How does someone get used to something like that? At that moment, the fear of what I saw in the storage room was replaced by the terror of what Yuri had become. Someone who thought it was normal to live with a ghost. The following days were horrible in a quiet way. Every time a light trembled, I felt a shiver. Every time a customer turned up the volume on a speaker to test it, my body froze. I always worked tense, waiting for the next scare. The worst was looking at Yuri. He went on with life calmly. Sometimes he even hummed low while arranging a shelf. His normalcy was the most terrifying thing in the world. Over time, things kept happening. They were small provocations, almost always harmless. A television in the display window that turned off by itself, the light in the small bathroom in the back that flickered and went out right when I entered, leaving me in the dark. A pile of manuals that slipped and fell to the floor, without anyone being nearby. For each event, Yuri's explanation was the same. It was the kid, and the manager's when he saw was always the same litany about the electrical network. I realized I wasn't going to last long living in that state of tension. My sleep was worse. I was always tired, always at my limit. That's when, out of pure desperation, I think, I started trying a different approach. I came from a house where there were always children running, screaming, making mischief. Maybe it was just that, a lonely child wanting attention. I started creating an image in my head. A boy maybe about 7 or 8 years old, a little chubby, with messy hair. I gave him a name I kept just to myself, Ryan. It seemed less scary to think of him like that. When the storage room light went out, instead of panicking, I would breathe deeply and speak softly so no one would hear. "Okay, Ryan, I get it. Now let me get the box, please." It seems crazy, I know, but in a bizarre way it started working. By giving a name, a face, an almost innocent intention to those things, I felt like I was taking some of his power over me away. The provocations continued, but they started scaring me less and irritating me more, like the pranks of one of my siblings. I was, in my way, getting used to it. I was creating routine within the haunting, a set of rules not to go crazy. This strange peace, this truce I created myself, lasted several months. I no longer jumped at every different sound. I just sighed, thought, it was Ryan again, and continued with my work. I really believed I had found a way to live with that, to transform fear into a simple inconvenience. But I was wrong. I wasn't taming the situation. I was just feeding something I didn't understand, giving it an attention that soon I would discover it would use against me in the worst possible way. I clung to that Ryan fantasy with all my strength. It was my shield, and for a good time it seemed enough. Things happened, I responded with forced patience, and the day ended. But gradually, the tone of the game started to change. It was subtle. A computer mouse I was using that suddenly slid by itself across the screen, closing a window. Small objects on the counter that didn't just fall, but seemed to be pushed with a certain irritation. The feeling was no longer of a child wanting attention, but of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. Still, I clung to my version. It was easier. The definitive break came on a Thursday. Movement was weak, afternoon dragging. Yuri had gone out to solve something at the bank, and the manager was locked in his little room, probably struggling with some spreadsheet. I was alone in the store. A customer called, asking me to confirm the code of a product that was in a heavy box on the highest shelf in the storage room. I breathed deeply. Going into the storage room alone still gave me chills, but I already had my script. "It's just Ryan," I repeated to myself. I got the metal step ladder and went to the back. The air inside was always stiller. I positioned the ladder, climbed the 2 steps, and stretched to reach the box. And like clockwork, the light went out. The darkness was complete. This time I wasn't even scared. I just felt deep tiredness. "Ah, come on, Ryan," I whispered to nothing. "I'm busy now." That's when I heard the laugh again, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the distant breath, almost imagined. It was right there behind me, close to my neck, and the tone was different. It was a sharp, mocking sound, a sound that said, "Got you." Before I could have any reaction, I felt pain. A violent tug in my hair, right at the root. A real force pulled back. Hard. I lost my balance on the ladder, my hands letting go of the shelf in a useless reflex. I fell, tumbled down the 2 steps, and landed sitting on the floor with a dull thud. I stayed there in the dark with suspended breathing and a burning pain in my scalp. The Ryan fantasy, the lonely boy, ended in a second. That wasn't a game. That wasn't a child. That thing had hurt me on purpose. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. There was no more laughter. There was nothing more, just the certainty that I wasn't alone in that darkness, and the thing that was with me was malicious. I don't remember how I got out of the storage room. I just know that in an instant I was back in the store light, feeling my heart pulse in my neck, and with my hand on the sore spot on my head. When Yuri returned from the bank, about 20 minutes later, he must have seen my state. I was pale, with wide eyes, sitting on a little stool behind the counter. "What's that face?" he asked, dropping his things on the table. The kid acted up again. My voice had the same tone as always, but I couldn't take it anymore. "He hurt me, Yuri," I spoke, and my voice came out shaky. He pulled my hair hard. I fell from the ladder. For the first time in months, I saw Yuri's face of indifference change. He stopped what he was doing and really stared at me. There was a wrinkle of concern on his forehead. "Pulled," he repeated low. He had never done that. His confirmation that this was new only made everything worse. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. At every shadow or sound in the store, my whole body contracted. I got home exhausted, but knowing one thing, I couldn't deal with that alone anymore. Ignoring didn't work. Trying to understand had been even worse. I needed real help, and there was only one person I trusted for something like that. The next day, my day off, I went to my grandmother's house. Her house had always been my refuge. It has that little smell of corn cake and freshly brewed coffee, the walls full of family photos, and a small altar with some little saints in the corner of the living room. She listened to me tell everything. Sitting in her rocking chair, without saying a word, just looking at me with those eyes that seemed to know everything. When I finished, she didn't make any fuss, just got up, went to the bedroom, and came back with a small glass bottle, one of those old perfume ones. Inside, a transparent liquid with some green leaves floating. "It's water with rue," she said, handing me the bottle. Her hand was warm and firm. "You're going to take this, and when no one is looking, you're going to spray a little in the corners of the store, especially in that storage room." I held the bottle that was still warm from the sun hitting the bedroom window. "And most importantly, Celia," she continued, holding my chin and making me look at her, "don't be afraid. You can't show fear. These things feed on that. When you go to do it, be firm. Show him that you're the one in charge there." I left her house feeling like another person. The fear was still there, a tightness in my stomach, but now it had a purpose. I had a plan, I had a weapon. It's been 6 months since that Thursday, and indeed, the war is over. Never again has a light flickered. Never again has a television turned off by itself. Objects remain exactly where I put them. Yuri even commented the other day with a much more relieved voice. "Looks like the kids settled down, huh?" I just gave a weak smile and agreed. But he didn't settle down, he didn't leave. I know he didn't. The store became silent, yes, but it's not a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, loaded silence. It's the silence of someone who was put in timeout and now stares at you from the corner of the room without blinking. When I need to go to the storage room, which I avoid as much as possible, the feeling is 1,000 times worse than before. There's no longer the fear of a scare. There's the certainty of a presence that hates me. I feel a cold that doesn't come from temperature, and the constant impression that someone is watching me from the shadows, with a grudge that I created myself. Sometimes I think if I did the right thing. I think about my silly idea of giving him a name, of trying to understand him as a child. Maybe I was arrogant. Maybe by confronting him, I didn't expel him. I just transformed him. The mischievous boy is gone, and in his place, something else remained, something older and more patient that now just watches and waits. The truth is that winning this fight had a bad taste. I'm no longer afraid of attacks, but I live with the dread of what this new peace means. Yesterday night, I was the last to leave. After locking the store's glass door, I turned to leave, and for a second my own reflection seemed wrong. Inside there, in the store's penumbra, right at the back of the corridor, there seemed to be a small dark silhouette standing looking at me. I felt a tingling in my neck in the same place as the old pain. I blinked, and there was nothing more there besides the shelves and the normal night shadows. But I know what I saw. He's still there. And the truce I conquered with rue water and courage seems, each day that passes, more and more fragile. The worst part is that I understand now that I was never dealing with just a mischievous child. What I thought was Ryan, the lonely boy who just wanted attention, was something much darker from the beginning. I created a safe image in my mind to cope, but the truth was always there, lurking in the shadows. The electronics store has become a different place since that confrontation. During the day, with customers coming and going, Yuri organizing inventory, and the manager buried in his paperwork, everything seems normal. But there's an undercurrent now, a tension that wasn't there before. The other employees have started noticing things too. Maria, who works part-time on weekends, mentioned that she feels watched when she's alone in certain sections. Carlos, the delivery guy, refuses to go to the storage room by himself anymore. He says the air there feels thick and makes him nervous. Even the customers seem to sense something. I've noticed people hurrying through certain aisles, or children clinging closer to their parents when we pass near the back of the store. A mother asked me last week if we had had any incidents in the building, saying her 5-year-old refused to go near the storage area and kept asking about the sad boy. The sad boy. Those words stuck with me for days. Maybe that's what I should have seen from the beginning. Not a mischievous child playing pranks, but something genuinely sad, angry, and trapped. Something that had been trying to communicate the only way it knew how. And I had inadvertently made it worse by treating it like a game. Yuri and I don't talk about it anymore. There's an unspoken agreement between us to pretend everything is normal. But I catch him sometimes, staring toward the storage room with a worried expression, or jumping slightly when a customer drops something loudly. The easy acceptance he once had is gone, replaced by a nervous awareness that something has fundamentally changed. The manager still gives his electrical problems speech to new employees, but even he seems less convinced lately. Last month, when we had a brief power outage that affected the whole building, I saw him watching the storage room door with suspicious eyes as the lights came back on everywhere except that one corner, which stayed dark for almost a full minute longer than the rest. I've thought about quitting, finding another job, starting fresh somewhere else. But I'm afraid of what that might mean. What if leaving doesn't solve anything? What if the problem isn't tied to the store, but to me? What if my attempt to banish it only taught it how to follow? The Rue water is almost gone now. My grandmother gave me the recipe to make more, but she warned me that it's not a permanent solution. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs stitches, she said during my last visit. Eventually, you'll need to find the real source of the problem. But I'm not sure I want to know what the real source is. Sometimes, ignorance feels safer than knowledge. Sometimes, an uneasy truce feels better than an uncertain war. As I write this, sitting in my small apartment on my day off, I can hear the city humming outside my window. Normal sounds of normal life. Cars passing, neighbors talking, children playing in the courtyard below. It all feels surreal after spending so much time in that charged atmosphere at work. But even here, in my own space, I find myself checking corners and listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The boundary between work and home, between the haunted and the safe, has become blurred. I sleep with lights on more often than I care to admit, and I've started keeping a small bottle of the Rue water on my nightstand, just in case. Tomorrow I go back to work. Tomorrow I'll unlock that glass door, turn on the lights, and pretend that everything is fine. I'll serve customers, organize inventory, and avoid the storage room as much as possible. And somewhere in the back of that store, in the shadows between the shelves, something will be waiting and watching, as patient as death itself. The truce holds for now. But truces, by their very nature, are temporary things. And I have the growing certainty that this story isn't over yet. It's just moved into a new chapter, one where the rules have changed and the stakes have gotten higher. Maybe that's what scares me most of all. Not that the thing is still there, but that I'm starting to understand it was never really gone to begin with. It was just waiting for me to realize that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The electronics store on 5th Street looks perfectly normal from the outside. Customers come and go, Business continues as usual, and if you didn't know better, you'd think it was just another ordinary retail space in the city's commercial district. But inside, in the spaces between the fluorescent lights and the humming of devices, something patient waits. Something that learned long ago that the best way to hide is in plain sight, and that the most effective hauntings are the ones that look like everyday life. And I'm the only one who knows that our peaceful coexistence is built on the thinnest of foundations, held together by nothing more than holy water, herb bundles, and the stubborn hope that some problems can be managed rather than solved. But hope, like truces, can be fragile things. And in the electronics store on 5th Street, patience is a virtue that both the living and the dead have learned to master. My name is Mario, and I've always had a somewhat distant relationship with my family. I'm not the type of person who gets along wonderfully with everyone, but there's something about family gatherings that occasionally makes me think maybe it would be good to strengthen bonds. This was the case that weekend. I had spent a couple of years without seeing my cousins, aunts, and uncles. And when my mother suggested I spend a weekend at the family ranch, I decided it was a good opportunity to escape routine and the city. The family ranch is located on the outskirts of a small town in Montana, about 2 hours by car from the city. It's an old house my grandparents bought decades ago. It's not a mansion, but it has a solid structure and spacious gardens that have grown wild over time. The house, though somewhat rundown, always seemed like a peaceful place to me, almost like a time capsule. In my childhood visits, I had always liked the idea of being there, surrounded by nature, away from the city's hustle and bustle. However, on this occasion, something wasn't the same. Maybe it was my age, maybe my recent experiences, but I felt a strange discomfort approaching that house. Friday afternoon, I arrived at the ranch with the trunk full of clothes and some provisions. The ranch, as always, was surrounded by cornfields and pastures, with the sound of crickets resonating in the air. My Aunt Laura and my cousins welcomed me, and although the house seemed the same as I remembered, there was something in the atmosphere that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the silence or the fact that the ranch was more disorganized than on other occasions. There wasn't that cozy feeling I used to experience as a child. Something felt different. The first night we spent pleasantly. I dined with my aunt and cousins, and although the conversation was lively, I noticed my relatives seemed somewhat tense, especially when they talked about the house and things that used to happen on the ranch. My aunt, despite always being a strong and cheerful woman, spoke somewhat evasively when I asked about my grandparents. She mentioned they used to live there, but the house had its secrets. She said it so casually that at the time I didn't give it much importance. I thought it was just a way of speaking. That night, as I settled into the room that had always been mine, an old room on the 2nd floor with large windows facing the field, I felt strangely restless. The house seemed to creak with every gust of wind, and the air, though fresh, had an old smell, almost of humidity. I tried to sleep, but something wouldn't let me rest. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe the feeling of being surrounded by something I couldn't identify, something that was latent in the dark corners of that house. Saturday morning, I got up early. The ranch had always been a quiet place, ideal for disconnecting from everything. I decided to walk through the fields, enjoy nature and fresh air. While walking through the backyard, I came across an old shed I hadn't noticed before. It was partially covered by weeds, and the wooden door, though closed, seemed about to fall. Intrigued, I approached and tried to open it. It was locked, but something inside caught my attention. I felt pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me, but I quickly dismissed it as a simple sensation. My name is Mariana Izquierdo. I was born in Phoenix, but for more than 10 years I've lived and worked in the Olympic National Forest Reserve in Washington State. I'm a forest ranger. My job consists of patrolling the main trails, documenting flora and fauna, checking for illegal logging, fires in prohibited areas, or poaching activities. I live alone in a wooden house assigned by the Forest Service. It's within the reserve perimeter, an hour by ATV from the nearest community called Cedar Falls. Sometimes other colleagues visit me, especially when there are biological counts or fire brigades, but most of the time I'm alone. I don't complain. I love this place. It's a dense forest, alive, always breathing. Here I've seen elk, black bears on trail cameras, spotted owls calling at dawn, and Douglas firs so tall they seem to hold up the sky. But there are also things that don't appear in brochures, things that aren't talked about. It started in November of last year. I noticed some strange marks on trees while doing an inspection on the Green Ridge Trail, a path we use little because it crosses a complicated rocky area. There were cuts in tree bark, small triangles carved in wood with a knife, one every 100 feet approximately. It wasn't graffiti or animal traces, it was intentional. I took them for what they seemed, human signals, maybe illegal hunters or orchid traffickers. In this area, they're abundant and have value in the black market. I reported the marks in the daily report and asked for support to patrol that area thoroughly. But since there was no evidence of illegal activity, they didn't give it priority. They recommended I just register them as suspicious traces and maintain surveillance. That's what I did. Days later, I saw more. On another trail, Cascade Creek, I found similar marks but with different shapes. Now they were squares with a diagonal line. The marks weren't fresh. Some already had dried sap covering the edges. I got the impression they had been there for time, but no one had noticed them. I began making a map, noting the exact location with my GPS. When connecting the points, I realized the marks formed a route that didn't coincide with any of the official trails. It was as if someone was moving through the undergrowth, leaving a coded trail. Then I started seeing other signals, small piles of stones carefully stacked, hidden at the foot of large trees, leaves tied with vines in X shapes stuck on low branches. I even found a rusted wire figure tied to a fallen trunk. It had the shape of a cross, but twisted. I took photos of everything. I showed it to Noah, a biologist colleague who works at a monitoring station further north. I showed him the map, the marks. He listened carefully, but shrugged. It could be people doing rituals. There are many communities that come to do their things in the forest. Cleanings, offerings. These aren't offerings, I told him. It's a path. That same night, while reviewing the photos on my computer, something disturbed me. In one of the images, taken in a clearing near Black Creek, there was a human figure in the background, barely visible, someone standing among trees with their back turned. I didn't remember seeing anyone. I magnified the image. You couldn't distinguish the face, but the posture was strange, as if listening to something or waiting. I felt pressure in my stomach. I decided not to mention it to my superiors for the moment. I didn't want them to think I was exaggerating or had lost my mind from being alone so long. Instead, I gathered courage and decided to follow the trail of marks. I started at dawn, carrying the essentials: radio, water, machete, compass, GPS, flashlight. I left written notice at the base with my projected route. I entered the forest following the triangular signals. Every so often a new mark appeared, as if someone had wanted to make sure you didn't get lost. I passed through areas I had never stepped on, trees covered with thick moss, roots like serpents, ferns as tall as people. The air became more humid as I advanced. At noon I found a network of branches tied in star shape, hanging from a tree with vines. It had black feathers and what looked like human hair. I noted everything. At 5 in the afternoon, I reached a clearing that didn't appear on any of our maps, and there it was. A wooden cabin half hidden among undergrowth, not old, not abandoned. It had a tin roof and smoke coming from a small chimney. I crouched behind a fallen trunk. I took out my binoculars. The door opened. A thin man came out with jeans and green shirt. He looked like a farmer. He carried a backpack and in his hand held a machete. He wasn't one of our firefighters. He didn't carry any insignia, any badge. He walked to a nearby tree and started making another mark on the bark, a diamond this time. He went back inside. I stayed there at least an hour. I didn't see anyone else, but I heard voices inside, at least 2 more people. They weren't local indigenous people. They spoke English with an accent, yes, but there was something strange in the tone, as if they were reading something. One said numbers. Another responded with short syllables. I retreated before nightfall. I returned to my station with an accelerated heart. That night, I didn't sleep well. I called Noah the next day. I told him everything. "That doesn't sound good, Mariana," he told me. "It could be a trafficking network, people or animals, and if they saw you." I didn't finish listening. I returned to base, talked to my boss director. I showed her the map, the photos, the video I managed to record from the clearing. They told me they would escalate it with the National Guard. They asked me not to return alone to that area. 2 days later, the cabin disappeared. We returned with 2 armed elements. The clearing was there, yes, but there was no trace of smoke or recent marks. The earth seemed disturbed. We found some campfire remains, food cans, and a tarp partially buried. There were no footprints, no tree marks. The signal path I had followed so carefully had disappeared. But not completely. A week later, when leaving early for my round, I found a triangle carved on my station door. A perfect triangle, fresh, made with knife. There are no words to describe what I felt. A kind of cold heat entered me, as if my body understood before my mind. Someone had followed me. Someone wanted me to know they were no longer the ones leaving signals. Now I was the signal. Since then I sleep with the lamp on. I stopped patrolling alone. I temporarily moved to reserve offices closer to the highway. But sometimes at dawn, when there's mist, I swear I see new marks on trees, as if inviting me to follow another path. One that doesn't appear on maps, one someone designed with patience, one that still hasn't ended. And if you ask me what I discovered in there, I'll tell you. It wasn't a ritual, it wasn't smuggling, it wasn't one more camp. It was a network of people who used the forest as a board, who leave signals among themselves like breadcrumbs in the mountains. And now that I know it, I have a certainty that doesn't let me sleep. I shouldn't have followed the trail because now I'm part of it. Since I found that mark on my door, that perfectly carved triangle, I stopped feeling safe anywhere. Not at the Forest Service station, not at base camp, not even at the offices in Seattle. When I went to make the internal report, something happened I hadn't anticipated. Noah, my biologist colleague, disappeared. It was a January morning. He went out with his equipment to monitor northern spotted owls in the Cascade Falls area. The aerial patrol saw him camp at the agreed point. Then there were no more traces, no return tracks, no radio signals. They sent a crew to look for him. They only found his GPS thrown next to a mossy stone, still on, marking a route that didn't match the official one. It wasn't normal for Noah to do that. He knew the protocols well. When they told me, I felt like an icy current ran down my back. It wasn't my fault, I knew. But it was he who encouraged me to follow the trail. It was he who saw the photos, the only one I really trusted. A week later, a box without return address arrived at the small office, small cardboard. It had no data, just my name written with black marker in handwriting I didn't recognize. The office staff left it on my desk thinking it was field material or something I had ordered. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in wet newspaper, was a bunch of dried vines braided in diamond shape, a figure identical to those I had seen tied to trees inside the forest. Stuck to the braid with electrical tape was a USB memory. I took it to my personal computer. My hands were shaking. There was only one untitled, undated video file. I opened it. It was a nighttime recording made with a portable infrared camera. The image was greenish, grainy. You could see Noah with a sleepy face and flashlight in hand, walking among dense trees. He was breathing heavily. He was alone. The video lasted exactly 5 minutes. In the last 30 seconds, the camera turned abruptly toward a clearing. There were human figures among the trees, standing. You couldn't see faces, just silhouettes. And just when Noah pointed the flashlight toward one of them, the screen went black. End of video. No screams were heard. There was no blood. Just a silence that said more than any sound. I went directly to the regional chief. "And why didn't you report this before?" she asked me without looking up from the paper. "Because you didn't believe me the first time." They took the box, called state police, interviewed me twice. The USB was sent for analysis to the Capitol, but I already knew what they were going to say. No clear evidence. The video could have been manipulated. We don't know if it was recorded inside the reserve. There aren't sufficient elements to open a formal investigation. A few days later, they asked me to take vacation to calm down. It was an elegant way of telling me I was causing noise, but I didn't stay quiet. I returned to my map, to the points I had marked from the beginning, the marks, triangles, diamonds, stone piles. The pattern was still there, a hidden path, a network, and an area in the center I still hadn't fully explored. The mountain informally called by locals Shadow Ridge. It doesn't appear with that name on maps. It's a promontory of dense vegetation where almost no light or sound enters. An area workers avoid for practical reasons, too steep, unstable terrain, but that locals mention with respect. One goes in there, but not everyone comes out, Don Teofilo, an old man from Cedar Falls, told me when I asked. Why? Because it's not for just anyone. There are buried things, things from before. I returned alone. It wasn't the most intelligent decision, I know. I carried my complete equipment. I left my route registered, recorded in a voice note on my cell phone sent to a friend outside the state. I entered Shadow Ridge from the north side, where trees close like a dome and moss covers even the stones. I walked for hours without marks, without signals, until I reached a horseshoe-shaped rock formation. There I found something that took my breath away. An underground camp, not like the one I had seen before. This was hidden under undergrowth with a burrow-type entrance, covered with dry branches and loose earth. I descended carefully. It was an ample space with earth walls reinforced with logs. There were benches, blackboards with numbers, codes, drawn routes, and worst of all, photographs. Dozens people, all taken in the forest. Some were tourists, others forest rangers, and others indigenous people from nearby communities. I saw at least 6 faces I recognized: colleagues, farmers, the occasional guide. And Noah was in the lower corner of a blackboard, a photo taken from height. He was looking at the ground. I felt my head spinning. I took out my cell phone to record, but just when I started filming, I heard footsteps outside, slow, measured. I turned off the flashlight. I crouched behind a pile of jute sacks. 2 people entered. I didn't see them, but their voices were different, a man and woman. They spoke low. They didn't mention names. One said, "The GPS one is still missing." And the other responded, "She already marked her entrance. She has no exit." It took me seconds to understand. The GPS one is me, because only I had recorded each mark, each coordinate. Only I had linked them. I don't know how I got out of there. I ran in darkness. I tore my arm with a thorn. I left the machete behind. I fell at least twice. I didn't look back. I reached base station at dawn, dehydrated, trembling. I didn't say anything at the moment. I waited a day, then asked for formal transfer. They didn't ask me why. They accepted without problems. Now I'm assigned to Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. Less dense, more people, more open. But every so often, when I'm alone on the path, I find myself looking at trees, searching for triangles, diamonds, or new marks I didn't make. And sometimes, for seconds, I have the sensation someone is watching me from deep in the forest. It's not a myth. It's not a rural legend, it's real. There are people using forests as hidden routes, as labyrinths, as transport networks the system doesn't see. And some of us are just points on their maps. I no longer want to know how many are inside. I just want to make sure I'm not the next marker. My name is Luis Rios. I'm a forest ranger at the Cascade Mountain Reserve, a mountainous area located in northern Oregon, near the Washington border. I've worked here for the past 12 years, patrolling on foot and by ATV the trails that cross the old-growth forest, knowing every path, canyon, and creek like the back of my hand. My job isn't like they paint it on television. I don't live in a wooden tower or spend the day watching for fires from a distance. I deal with poachers, irresponsible tourists, trash hidden in black bags among the bushes, and all kinds of emergencies that only those of us who walk the mountains know how to handle. Every day is different. But if there's one thing I'm clear about, it's that in these hills there are no secrets that can last long without being noticed. Or so I believed. Everything began to change in June of last year. During a routine patrol, I had to cover a little frequented section of the northeast sector of the reserve. That area isn't open to the public. It was closed more than a decade ago due to constant landslides and because the trails became unsafe. There's no signage or marked routes. No one, in theory, should be walking around there. That day I started climbing an old logging road that had almost been swallowed by moss and roots. I carried my backpack, my radio, and an old digital camera I used to document everything for reports. The weather was cloudy, and the smell of humidity filled the air. Halfway to the Beacon Hill summit, at about 6,000 feet of altitude, I noticed something strange. A recent mark on the ground, like thin tire tracks. They weren't from a motorcycle or 4x4. They looked more like a mountain bike with deep tread, recent. I crouched down to look at them. They weren't more than 3 days old. Who the hell is climbing up here? I asked myself quietly. A few meters ahead, I found the next thing. A cigarette butt still whole and an energy bar wrapper from an imported brand, the kind they don't sell in nearby towns. I noted it in my notebook. It's not that finding trash was rare, but no one had permission to walk in that area. I continued climbing, and an hour later, through the thickness of the forest, I saw it. A single-story wooden cabin with a rusted tin roof and old log walls. It wasn't collapsed or beaten by time. On the contrary, it was clean, maintained, with the grass around it cut, and a small stone path well placed. At first glance it seemed abandoned, but the details told me otherwise. There was firewood stacked to one side of the entrance, covered with black plastic. The windows had new metal mesh. There was a thick padlock on the door, the kind they sell at expensive hardware stores. And on the roof, a small solar panel. I stood for a while without moving, observing. I approached from the right side and noticed that behind the cabin there was an improvised water tank made with barrels and PVC pipes. Whoever set that up knew what they were doing. I took out my camera and took several photos. Then I approached the door. I knocked. No one answered. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing. I circled the cabin carefully. In the back there was a small cleared area with a well-made fire pit covered with Black River stones. There was no fresh ash, but there were signs it had been used recently. A few meters away I found definitive proof. An old boot with wet mud planted on a stone as if someone had left it there to dry. It wasn't a work or hiking boot. It was military style, thick sole. Next to it, hanging from a branch, was a black thermal shirt, also freshly washed. I didn't know whether to wait for someone to return or if it was better to retreat. I opted for the second. I returned to headquarters with the photos and put together a detailed report. I delivered it to the station chief, Don Pedro, with whom I've shared years of work. He looked at me with a furrowed brow as he went through the photos one by one. "That cabin wouldn't be old Becerra's, would it?" he asked. "No, Becerra's is in another sector, and it fell down 5 years ago. This one is maintained." He remained silent for a while, thoughtful. Then he said something that made me uncomfortable. "Don't mention it to anyone else." "Yes, let me see if there's something in the old records, but for now, continue with your normal rounds." That's what I did, or at least I tried. 2 weeks later, I returned to the place. This time I went up earlier with the idea of finding some new clue or, with luck, the occupant. I carried my thermos, some sweet bread, and 2 flashlights in case the afternoon caught me. When I arrived, it was already past 11 in the morning. The cabin was different not in structure, but in atmosphere. There were clear signs of recent presence, fresher tracks, marks in the grass, and most noticeably, a bicycle leaning against a tree. Mountain bike, Italian brand, expensive, with fresh mud on the tires. I approached very slowly. There was sound inside, not voices, but like movement, very slow steps, dragging something. I knocked on the door once, then again. The sound stopped. I received no response. "I'm from the Forest Ranger Corps. I come to do a verification," I said aloud in a firm tone. "This area is outside authorized access. I need you to come out to identify yourself." Silence. I waited. When I was already thinking of leaving, the door opened just a few centimeters. From the other side, a low male voice said, "I'm just passing through. I'm not going to stay." "I need your name and some document." "I don't have any." "Are you camping here?" "No, I'm just coming to check something." I didn't know what to answer. Something in his tone made me feel he knew I couldn't force him to come out. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't scared either. It was as if he already expected me to arrive. "I'm going to make a report," I said finally. The door closed slowly. I took photos, left. That same afternoon, Don Pedro called me to his office. He had an even more furrowed brow than the previous time. "Louis," he told me in a measured tone, "that cabin doesn't appear on maps since 2002. But there's something you should know." He opened an old drawer and took out a yellowed folder. Inside were photocopies of reports with state government stamps from the time when the area was less supervised. That cabin belonged to a family that disappeared in '99. They were known as the Salgados. The father worked as a communication tower technician. The mother sold natural medicine. They went into that area without permission and never returned. The only thing found was the cabin burned from the inside. No one rebuilt it, or so we thought. I was left cold. So, someone rebuilt it without notice, or someone has been using it all this time without being seen. I asked for authorization to install a trail camera, the kind we use to monitor wildlife. He denied it. "Louis, leave it like that. Don't continue patrolling that sector." I didn't like it, but I obeyed. 3 months passed. One December night we received a call from the community of Pine Valley at the foot of the reserve. A farmer reported seeing a figure crossing the mountain with a red lamp near where I knew the cabin was. I went without notice. I climbed in the darkness, guiding myself with my flashlight. I didn't carry a radio. I walked in silence, just with my machete hanging from my waist. The cabin was there, but the bicycle was gone. There were no signs of fire, no recent tracks. I approached from the back and saw it, a wall completely opened, as if they had removed the entire thing. Inside there were documents stuck with thumbtacks, old maps, annotations, names of unofficial trails, a sheet with a list of 3 dates. One of them coincided with the day I went up for the first time, and in a corner, a word written in red marker, Ranger. I left there with my pulse racing. I didn't take photos. I didn't want to leave a trace. The next day, the cabin was no longer dismantled, as if no one had ever lived there, as if they had picked it up piece by piece. Today, I continue working at Cascade Mountain. Don Pedro has already retired. The new chief doesn't know anything about what happened, but I still keep the photos from that first time. Sometimes I look at them just to remind myself that the forest is also used by people who don't want to be found, and that there are places, even though they're on the map, where one has no authority, because sometimes you're not patrolling, they're watching you. After the cabin disappeared, I tried to leave everything for peace. I continued with my routine, checking assigned sectors, filling out my logs, and during breaks going for walks with newer colleagues on controlled routes. Nothing out of the ordinary, but it's not so easy to pretend you didn't see what you saw. I had the photos, not just of the cabin, but also of the interior. I reviewed them at home at night when my wife was already asleep. I studied them like they were criminal evidence. I focused especially on the maps hanging on that back wall. They weren't common topographic maps. They were old, printed on glossy paper, hand-marked routes with names that didn't appear on any official plan. Red Trail, Dry Channel, Detour 11A, and that term Ranger, which appeared 2 more times on other papers stuck with tape. I tried searching for that word on the internet, in forestry surveillance forums, even in government archives. Nothing. In that context, it made no sense. I thought about talking to some contact from the ecological police, but I lacked evidence and didn't want to raise suspicions either. There's something you learn in this job. When someone does things in silence for years without getting caught, it's because they know more than you do. About a month later, in January, I was assigned to patrol Sector 6B, a low and much more accessible area, right at the foot of the routes that lead to Beacon Hill. During a walk along a dry creek, I met a middle-aged man sitting on a stone. He wasn't carrying a backpack or equipment, just a navy blue jacket, beige pants, good boots, and a carved wooden staff. He didn't seem lost. I approached calmly. "Everything okay, sir?" "Yes, just resting," he answered without looking at me. "I've known this trail for years." "Do you have permission? This area isn't open to the general public." He looked at me. His eyes were very dark, and I don't know why, but I felt he already knew me. Sometimes you don't need permission. Sometimes you just need to not leave a trace. I didn't know what to say. He got up slowly, adjusted his jacket, and asked me, "You're the one who went up to see the cabin, right?" I froze for a moment. I didn't confirm it, but I didn't deny it either. "What was that place?" I asked. "An observation point, but it's no longer there because someone crossed the threshold." "What threshold?" "The one of those who know too much and can't return to ignorance." He left without saying more. He walked uphill on a route I knew, but that hadn't existed for years due to a landslide in 2006. Part of the hill came down and was never reopened. I walked behind him about 20 meters just to check if I had seen him correctly. But the man was no longer there. Only the footprints in the wet earth, fresh, undeniable. The next day, I asked for access to the park's physical archives, the ones kept in the locked warehouse dating from the opening of the reserve in the 70s. It was a complicated task: forms, signatures, even calls to the state coordinator. But they authorized me with certain conditions: not to take anything from the archive, not to make copies, not to take photos. I spent 3 days in the cold room smelling dust and humidity. And it was in an unmarked box among unclassified papers where I found something that made me stop. A report dated in 1998, signed by someone from the previous Forest Surveillance Corps, already deceased, said, "During patrol in area closed to public, a rustic construction of dwelling type was identified. No cadastral registry, no evident agricultural use. Signs of recent occupation were observed. Entry was not made for security reasons. Presence of observers reported. No intervention reported. It's recommended not to return. Below, a phrase written by hand. The presence of rangers is cyclical. Do not intervene. Do not investigate. There was the word again, rangers. I don't know what it really meant. I don't know if it was an internal code or something the old-timers invented to disguise what they couldn't explain. But that word had followed me for months, and now it was in the archives. Shortly after that, access to Sector 6B was restricted for maintenance. No one explained why to me. We just received a circular saying internal routes should be closed for technical work. I knew it was something else. A week later, the forest surveillance drone we used to monitor logging and fire presence marked thermal activity exactly where the cabin had been. The coordinates were clear, but when we went up as a team to check, there was nothing, no trash, no tracks, no traces that a structure had ever been there. One of the new guys, a young man from California named Hugo, told me quietly as we walked back, "Don Lewis, sometimes when I patrol alone on this side of the hill, I get the impression they're watching me, but there's never anyone there." From where, he pointed west, from the high point near the old tower. But that tower was completely removed 8 years ago. Since then, I haven't talked to anyone about the subject again, but something changed in me. I no longer patrol the same way. I walk slower, listen more. And there are nights when I go out to smoke on the porch of the house they assigned me at the forest post. And I think I see a small red light blinking among the trees, as if someone is watching me from the mountain. I don't approach. I don't want to know if it's real. This isn't a story. It's not a legend. It's just a log I'm leaving here in case someday someone else finds the cabin. Or if any of you see maps with routes that aren't marked or find a word written with red marker that shouldn't be in an official file. If you see something that seems to be hidden on purpose, it's probably not a mistake. Probably someone doesn't want you to know they're there. And if you see the word ranger, turn around, don't ask questions, and above all, don't follow the path. I'm a municipal police officer in Texas. For security reasons, I won't give my name or the exact location. But I can say this happened a few months ago, in the early morning hours. One of those nights when everything seems calm until it isn't. My partner and I were finishing our patrol in the area. It was about 1:40 in the morning, and whenever we could, before going to another location, we'd stop by to eat at a little stand that's set up almost at the edge of a highway, right where the warehouse district begins. The man who ran it was a good guy. He'd known us for a long time. He was one of those people who'd give you extra food without charging. We knew he closed at 3 in the morning, so we could still catch something. That night when we arrived, we saw he had company. Behind the taco vendor at a small metal table sat an elderly man, somewhat chubby, with a long white beard, completely bald, wearing a checkered shirt. He was just sitting there as if waiting to be served something, or maybe he was a helper. I greeted him out of courtesy. "Good evening, sir." But only the taco vendor responded, and that man didn't answer or look up. He just stayed there with his arms crossed over his chest. We ordered quickly. My partner and I got in the patrol car to do one last round while he prepared our food. A quick loop around the area and the warehouses. At 2:15 we were back. We parked in front of the stand to eat. I got out, thanked the taco vendor, and stayed chatting for a bit. While I was eating, I said, "What's up with the new helper? The old guy looks pretty tired." The man looked at me strangely. "What helper?" "The man who was sitting back there, where the metal table is," I said, pointing to the corner. The taco vendor looked down, stayed silent for a few seconds, then said, confused, "I don't have any helpers. I was alone tonight, like always." I thought maybe he'd been a customer, so I insisted. "Ah, so he was a customer. Pretty rude guy, didn't even say hello to me." That's when the taco vendor told me not to scare him, because he'd been alone when we arrived. We insisted that there had been an older man behind him, chubby, with a gray beard, bald. He pulled out his phone and I could see his hands shaking. He showed me a photo of the man. It was the same person I'd seen minutes before. I told him yes, that was the man we saw. With a trembling voice, he said, "That's my father, but he passed away 4 days ago. He always sat at that same table whenever he came." We stayed silent, my partner and I, just like the taco vendor. Both of us were waiting for him to tell us it was a joke, but he started crying. I apologized and told him not to be sad, that his father was still with him. I said it to comfort him, but I still couldn't believe we'd seen a ghost. My name is Peter. I'm 30 years old and usually spend most of my time working from home, which gives me the opportunity to escape the city's hustle and bustle and find some peace in the countryside's quieter corners. A month ago, a friend invited me to spend a weekend at his ranch, located on the outskirts of Colorado, surrounded by mountains and vast fields. The ranch was old, a colonial construction with adobe walls, surrounded by gardens that, though well-maintained, had that air of abandonment that only old properties can have. From the moment I arrived, the ranch captivated me. The fresh air and the sound of trees moved by wind gave me a peace I didn't experience in the city. My friend Javier was a calm and kind person, and his ranch was his escape place, his refuge. We spent the afternoon talking on the terrace while the sun set behind the mountains, bathing everything with golden light. But something in the atmosphere caught my attention, something subtle, like a shadow among trees that I couldn't fully identify. That sensation stayed with me during the day, though I tried to ignore it. The second day, after a substantial breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the surroundings. The terrain was extensive, with large grass areas, some scattered fruit trees, and small paths that wound through the fields. I wasn't surprised when I found myself alone on my walk, since Javier had stayed at the house, solving some matters. As I advanced down a path that bordered an old wooden fence, I noticed the landscape became more rustic, wilder. The path ended in a small plain where an ancient stone structure stood out in the middle of vegetation. I approached, curious. It was a well covered by a thick stone slab, almost hidden by moss and roots of nearby trees. The stone seemed to have been displaced slightly, leaving a small hole visible in the center of the well. The place seemed forgotten, and although my instinct warned me it wasn't a good idea to get too close, curiosity prevailed. I looked around, making sure no one was nearby, and crouched down to inspect the well in more detail. The well was made of stone, quite large and deep. Through the small hole I could see the interior walls still remained intact, covered with moss. But what caught my attention most was the strange reflection at the well's base. Something shiny like metal, reflected the little light entering through the hole. It was an object I couldn't identify from there, but that intrigued me deeply. My mind began formulating theories. It could be an ancient artifact, something valuable, or even a forgotten relic from past times. Without thinking too much, I looked for a way to descend into the well. There were nearby branches. I used to create a kind of improvised ladder. The hole wasn't very large, but sufficient for me to fit without much problem. Adrenaline began running through my veins as I descended carefully, making sure each step was firm. Upon reaching the bottom, the floor was covered with a layer of stagnant water, but not so deep as to hinder movement. The first thing I did was look toward the shiny object I had seen from the hole. I approached it, and upon removing it, I felt as if my breathing stopped for a second. It was a quite old metal box with a rusted lock that seemed to have been there for decades. The metal had a dark color, almost black, and was covered with a layer of dust and dirt, as if no one had touched that box in centuries. It was in poor condition, but I could still perceive details on its surface, an almost illegible inscription on the metal that I couldn't understand well. I felt a strange urgency to open it, though I didn't know why. Maybe it was the box's mystery that drove me, or perhaps the sensation that there was something hidden in that place, something I needed to discover. With effort, I managed to force the lock that gave way with a metallic sound. But the lid's weight was more than I expected. Upon opening it, I didn't know what to expect, but I never would have imagined what I found inside. Instead of precious objects or valuable relics, inside the box was a set of old black and white photographs and a small leather notebook, whose cover was worn by time's passage. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The photos showed several people, some quite familiar, but others were unknown. However, one of the photos especially caught my attention. It was a photo of a man and woman, both with serious expressions, dressed in clothing dating from more than 50 years ago. What impacted me wasn't the image itself, but the fact that those people's faces were identical to mine and Javier's. The same facial structure, the same eyes. It was as if the photo had been taken in the past, but the people appearing in it seemed to have been related to me and my friend. I felt a chill run through my body. The worst came after, when I took the leather notebook. Upon opening it, I found pages written by hand with old, trembling handwriting. At first, I didn't understand much of what it said, since words seemed mixed and in some cases illegible. But the phrase that appeared at the notebook's end was enough to make my stomach contract. They never leave, they just wait. I couldn't avoid cold sweat reading those words. My mind began to wander. What did that mean? Who had written those words? And why were they inside this forgotten well? Why did those people who seemed familiar somehow observe me from the photos as if they were waiting for something? While trying to think clearly, a feeling of pressure enveloped me. The air in the well began to feel denser, as if something was changing around me. I realized I had spent much time in the well, and it was already late. I decided to leave quickly, but when I tried to climb the improvised branch ladder, something stopped me. I felt a presence behind me. I turned immediately, but saw nothing. However, the air was heavier, and the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. The well, somehow, wouldn't let me leave easily. It wasn't just darkness or fear beginning to grow inside me. It was something in the environment, something palpable, as if the place didn't want me to go. My mind began to accelerate, and a thought crossed me like lightning. I wasn't alone in that well. The figures from the photos, those familiar faces, were watching me, and the sensation that something ancient, something that had been kept for years, wanted me to stay. Finally, I managed to get out of the well, but that experience left me with a mark I couldn't erase. The mysterious well, the box, the photos, the notebook, everything seemed like a puzzle I couldn't solve. Upon returning to the ranch, I told Javier what I had found, but he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "You shouldn't have gone there, Peter," he said, his voice almost whispering. "That place, that well has been there for generations. No one knows who built it or why, but people who have gone there have never returned the same. No one dares talk about it, but stories from my family about that well are strange. And you're not the first to discover it." That night, as I went to bed, I couldn't help looking at the clock. The hands moved slowly, as if time was trapped in that same place. I looked toward the field in the direction of the well, and although it was far, I felt something was calling me, something telling me it wasn't finished, that this story hadn't concluded yet. And with each whisper of wind, a part of me feared knowing what I had really discovered in that forgotten place. The following morning, I woke with the photos and notebooks still vivid in my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had found wasn't just old artifacts, but pieces of a puzzle much larger and more disturbing than I had initially thought. Javier had tried to warn me, but his words only increased my curiosity rather than diminishing it. During breakfast, I noticed Javier seemed more nervous than usual. He avoided direct eye contact, and his responses to my questions about the well were evasive. When I insisted on knowing more about his family's history with that place, he finally relented and told me something that made my blood run cold. "The well," he said quietly, looking around as if someone might be listening, "was discovered by my great-grandfather in 1923. At first, they thought it was just an old water source from previous settlers. But when they tried to use it, strange things began happening. People in the family started having vivid dreams about the people in those photographs you found. Dreams where those people would speak to them, asking them to join them down there. I felt my heart rate increase. What happened to your great-grandfather? He became obsessed with the well, started spending hours there every day, claiming he could hear voices calling to him. My great-grandmother found him one morning, sitting by the well's edge, talking to someone who wasn't there. He died 3 days later. Doctors said it was his heart, but the family knew better. The weight of Javier's words settled on me like a heavy blanket. I realized that what I had experienced at the well wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that had been repeating for nearly a century. That afternoon, despite Javier's warnings, I felt an irresistible pull to return to the well. I told him I was going for a walk, but I knew exactly where I was headed. The path seemed shorter this time, as if the well was drawing me toward it with each step. When I arrived, the stone slab had been moved further aside. The opening was now large enough for a person to enter easily without climbing down branches. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible. No one else knew about the well's location, and I certainly hadn't left it that way. But something deeper than logic compelled me forward. I peered down into the well and gasped. The metal box was no longer at the bottom. Instead, there was a rope ladder, old but sturdy, hanging down into the depths. And at the very bottom, I could see a faint light flickering, not electric, but like candlelight. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I began climbing down the rope ladder. The descent felt longer than it should have, as if the well was deeper than physically possible. The air grew colder with each rung, and I could hear something that made my skin crawl. Whispered conversations in voices I almost recognized. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a chamber much larger than the well's opening suggested. The walls were lined with dozens of photographs, all similar to the ones I had found in the box. Generations of faces stared back at me, and in each photo, I could see subtle similarities to myself and Javier: the same eyes, the same bone structure, as if we were all part of some extended, impossible family tree. In the center of the chamber sat an old man, though his face was partially obscured by shadows. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "Welcome, Peter," he said in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "We've been waiting for you to come back." "Come back," I stammered. "I've never been here before." The old man smiled, revealing teeth that seemed to have been carved from yellowed bone. "Haven't you? Look closer at the photographs, boy. Look at the dates." With trembling hands, I examined the photos on the walls more carefully. Many were dated from the 1920s and 30s, but as I moved along the wall, the dates became more recent. And there, in a frame near the back of the chamber, was a photograph that made me stumble backward in shock. It was me, standing by the well's edge, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been inside the well looking up. The date stamped on the bottom read 3 days ago, the day before I had first discovered the well. "Time works differently here," the old man explained, rising slowly from his seat. "We exist in the spaces between moments, in the gaps where memory fails. You've always been here, Peter. You've always been coming back." I turned to run, but the rope ladder was gone. The chamber's walls seemed to be closing in, and the photographs on the walls began to move, their subjects stepping out of their frames and walking toward me with outstretched arms. Somehow I found myself back at the surface, gasping and covered in cold sweat. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Javier was running toward me, calling my name with panic in his voice. "Peter, where have you been? I've been looking for you for hours." I looked at my watch. It showed the same time as when I had first approached the well that afternoon. But my clothes were covered with dust and cobwebs, and my hands were stained with something dark that looked like very old soil. That night I packed my bags and left the ranch without explanation. I couldn't bring myself to tell Javier about the chamber beneath the well, about the old man who seemed to know me, or about the photograph that shouldn't have existed. But as I drove away, I caught sight of the well's location in my rearview mirror. And standing beside it, just for a moment, I saw a figure waving goodbye. It looked exactly like me, but somehow older, as if it had been waiting by that well for much longer than should have been possible. I never returned to Javier's ranch, and I never spoke to him about what I had truly found down there. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I can still hear whispered voices calling my name, telling me it's time to come back home. And I know that someday, whether I want to or not, I will. My name is Luke, and I'm 36 years old. For years now, I've been setting up my taco stand every night on the corner of San Antonio Street, down in the old part of town. My business is simple, but I work it well. I stay open late, usually closing around 2:30 in the morning, sometimes 3 if sales are good. Nothing strange had ever happened to me before. No weird noises, no apparitions, none of those things you see on the internet. But if it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be here telling you about it. It was a Tuesday night, barely any customers. I was getting ready to close when this man approached me. His clothes were dirty, stained. You could tell he lived on the streets. He said to me, "Brother, can you spare me a taco? I'm really hungry." I didn't hesitate. Food is something you never deny anyone. I prepared him a complete order, handed him the plate, and he sat down on the curb right next to my stand. We started talking. I was sitting beside where I heat up the meat. He told me he used to work construction, that life had knocked him down after some tragedy. He didn't tell me what. But while we were talking, he started acting strange. Suddenly he'd go quiet, and then, as if he forgot I was there, he'd start arguing with someone. He'd turn to the empty air and say things like, "Shut up already, leave me alone, I'm eating." I thought he had schizophrenia or something like that, so I didn't judge. I just tried to be patient. But then I saw something that froze my blood. His clothes were lifting up by themselves. It was like something was pulling at his shoulder or the collar of his shirt, and it wasn't him. His hands were busy eating. I asked him, scared, "Are you okay? Do you want me to call someone?" And he answered me very calmly, "Don't be afraid. This demon won't hurt you. It only follows me." While we were talking, the plate he'd left on the ground also moved by itself. He didn't touch it. It dragged about 4 inches across the pavement. The man just laughed sadly. "You see, it won't even let me enjoy my food." And while he was trying to eat the last taco, something pulled his hair. I saw it happen. His head jerked backward. Then his hands were shaking on their own, like it was hard for him to bring the food to his mouth. I couldn't take it anymore. I told him to take the food and go eat peacefully somewhere else. I was practically kicking him out. He thanked me but left angry. Not at me, but at that thing. "It's always the same. You never leave me alone," I heard him shout. I lost sight of him, walking down the dark streets. Since that night, I've seen him pass by several times. I don't think he's crazy anymore. Now I believe something accompanies him, something you can't see, but you can feel. An entity, a demon, I don't know, but something is attached to him. Sometimes I wonder if they're haunting him for something he did, or if they simply feed off fear and pain. I'm a regular customer at a taco place near my house. I go there often because I really like how they prepare the food. The owner is always accompanied by several helpers, and they normally stay open very late, usually until 2 or 3 in the morning, because the place is on a busy avenue. One Halloween night, I went to have dinner there with my family around midnight. Everything was calm, but because of the date, I decided to ask the owner something I'd been wanting to know for a while. "Hey, hasn't anything strange ever happened to you here? Anything paranormal?" He looked at us, smiled slightly, as if he was embarrassed to tell us something, and said yes, that several times they'd been frightened. We thought he was joking, but he started telling us what they'd experienced. The first thing he told us was something that happened at his first location. That time they were in an area past midnight, very isolated, not far from there. That night it was past 1 in the morning. They had finished selling and were putting everything away in the truck. But that night, they started hearing laughter. Lots of laughter, men's and women's voices. The problem was it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. They thought it was from some neighbor having a party. But then one of the helpers, very scared, pointed toward the enormous trees that were a few yards away beside them. She screamed desperately, asking what that was. Everyone looked up, and in the trees in one of them, all the way to the top, there was a hooded figure. Below it was another, and below that thing, another one. 3 figures in total, sitting on the weak branches of that tree. When they saw them, those things started laughing louder. He says all 4 of them ran into the truck and didn't come out until those things disappeared. The second thing he told me happened about 2 years later in a town where you can clearly see the mountains. He says that night there were customers having dinner when out of nowhere they started hearing a humming sound. It was a very soft sound, like when something electrical passes nearby. Everyone started looking back toward the mountains, and what they saw was shocking. Several balls of fire started coming down from the sky, one after another, and they went into the mountain peaks. Nobody said anything, they just watched. Some people came over to tell them that was normal there, that in that area they often saw strange lights entering and leaving the mountains. People told them they were UFOs or maybe witches going in there. But the worst thing, according to him, was what they experienced in a place they rented for just 1 month. That location was on a main avenue, surrounded by several businesses. To the left, they had a convenience store attached, and to the right, a pharmacy. It was a very good spot for selling, because there were always people around. It was about midnight. At that moment, they had no customers, and that's when they heard something. A child's laughter, a laugh that got closer until the child came running into the restaurant. It was about a 5-year-old boy laughing hysterically who went straight to the bathroom. It was like someone was playing chase with him. He thought the kid had escaped from his parents, so he asked one of his helpers to go get him and take care of him. But when the waiter went over there, he came back pale without saying anything. And he asked about the child, but the waiter told him, "The child is gone." They all went to check the bathroom, and sure enough, there was nobody there. There was no way he could have gotten out another way. There were no windows, no back exits, nothing. That child had simply vanished. When we heard these stories, the owner told us, our skin crawled. We hadn't had any paranormal experiences ourselves, but we like listening to them. And I swear these stories he told us have been some of the most shocking I've ever heard in my life. Welcome. Before I begin this story, I'd like to know where you're listening from and what time you prefer to hear these tales. Let me know in the comments. Without further delay, let's begin. I had always dreamed of living somewhere remote, surrounded by nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The constant rush, the cars, the people, the noise, it all suffocated me. So when I found an isolated ranch on the outskirts of Montana, nestled in the middle of a small forest, I didn't hesitate for a second. It was the perfect opportunity to start fresh, to find peace, to escape from routine and daily pressures. The ranch was old, but it had character, a stone farmhouse with a large fireplace, many windows, and extensive grounds surrounded by trees, some grapevines, and a couple of corrals that I wasn't sure I'd use. As soon as I moved in, I felt free, as if the fresh country air had begun to cleanse something inside me. I spent the first few days organizing the house, cleaning and arranging what I could, enjoying the silence that surrounded me. The only thing that interrupted that tranquility was the sound of wild animals roaming the area and the wind through the trees. But the first nights were more unsettling than I expected. The ranch wasn't completely isolated, but it was quite far from other houses, so the nighttime silence was overwhelming. The first night, after settling in, I sat by the fireplace, and while reading a book, I realized how quiet everything was. No noise came from the streets. There were no sounds of cars or distant conversations, just the crackling of the fireplace wood and occasionally the distant call of an owl or the whisper of wind. It seemed perfect, almost unreal, but that first night I had trouble falling asleep. As darkness deepened, I began to hear something else, a low sound coming from outside. It was something difficult to identify, like a soft but constant tapping. I thought maybe it was the wind moving branches or some small animal running around the property, and I tried to ignore it. However, that feeling of unease grew during the following hours. The sound continued soft but persistent. The second night was worse. At first everything was quiet, but just like the night before, the noises began to appear. This time they weren't tapping sounds, they were footsteps, not many, but unmistakable, as if someone was walking around the house, touring the yard. At first I tried to think it was some animal, maybe a fox or some other nocturnal creature. But something about the cadence of the steps seemed too human to me. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the window. I looked toward the property, but I saw nothing, just the shadows of trees and the empty field. I felt foolish, even a bit paranoid, but something inside me said I shouldn't ignore it. The sound of footsteps continued for a while, and my mind began to play tricks on me. "It's just an animal," I repeated to myself. But hours passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something wasn't right. That night the feeling of unease accompanied me until dawn, when I finally managed to sleep, but the noises didn't disappear. The silence returned for a while, but then it happened again. Each night brought more noises, more footsteps. What had once been just a slight annoyance began to turn into a nightmare. I could no longer ignore them. I decided to talk to the few neighbors I had. There was a small store in the nearest village, and a couple of people who lived scattered around the surroundings. No one seemed to have noticed anything strange. But one of the older men I met, Don Francisco, looked at me with a serious expression when I mentioned the noises. "Those noises are old, son. They come from the land. That ranch has history," he told me in a grave voice. I tried to get him to explain, but he didn't want to go into details. He just told me that the people who lived there before had heard similar things and that I would get used to it. The way he said it left me uneasy, but I didn't want to give it too much importance. What could I do? I thought maybe it was just my mind creating ghosts, worrying about something as trivial as footsteps in the darkness. But things got worse. One night I decided to stay awake, determined to discover what was happening. I sat near the window with the flashlight off, waiting in the darkness. The wind blew gently and everything seemed calm. Then it began, a low tapping that quickly turned into more pronounced footsteps. At first it was on one side of the house. Then the footsteps moved around the yard. I couldn't see it, but I was sure that something or someone was there, walking around the ranch. The sound was getting closer. At that moment, a cold sweat ran down my back. I heard what sounded like someone was right on the other side of the window. It was so close that I could hear labored breathing, as if waiting for something. I jumped up and ran to the front door. I flung it open, but the yard was empty. There was nothing, just the darkness swallowing the terrain. I couldn't believe it. There was someone stalking me, but I couldn't see it. At first I tried to rationalize it, thinking that all of this was nothing more than a game of my mind. But each night the noises intensified, seemed to get closer, become clearer, and always in the same direction around the house. Sometimes I felt like someone was watching me from the window, as if waiting for me to look out so they could finally show their presence. The worst happened one night while I was trying to sleep. It was dawn, and suddenly I heard loud banging on the roof, as if something was walking above my bedroom. My heart raced. I got up quickly and tried to listen more. The noises continued, but now they weren't just coming from outside, but also from inside the house. Footsteps on the upper floor, where the empty rooms remained silent. I gathered courage. I climbed the stairs cautiously, but when I reached the second floor, the house was empty. No trace, no sound, everything was silent. I decided to check the attic, a small space I had discovered when I moved in. I went up to the attic with flashlight in hand, hoping to find something that would explain the noises. But all I found was dust and some old belongings covered with sheets. It was then that I saw something I didn't expect, a small hidden door behind some boxes. The door was slightly open. I hadn't noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached and pushed the door slowly. At first I only saw more darkness, but when I leaned in a little more, something glinted in the darkness. It was a small staircase that descended to an even darker space. My stomach churned. I wasn't prepared for what I would find, but the feeling that I could no longer turn back was stronger than fear. I went down the stairs slowly with the flashlight trembling in my hands. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a kind of small basement. The air was cold, stale, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I looked around, and what I saw made me jump back. On one of the walls there were marks in the wood, deep ones, as if something or someone had scratched them. The marks weren't just recent. Some seemed older, as if they had been made over many years. On the floor there were remains of dirt and dust, as if someone had been digging there. At that moment, I understood what was happening. This place, this ranch wasn't empty. Something had been living there, something that shouldn't be there. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the tracks in the attic, everything fit. Something or someone was trapped in that place. But what terrified me most was what I found in the darkest corner of the basement. An old box covered in dust with strange symbols carved into the lid. My heart was beating hard as I opened the box. Inside was something I never imagined, finding a series of old photographs. In them you could see several people, some with distorted faces, others with completely white eyes. But what took my breath away was the last photo. It was a recent photo of the ranch with someone in the background standing right at my window. The face was indistinguishable, but the figure was clearly there. Somehow everything I had heard, all the sensations I had had, all of that made sense. I wasn't alone on the ranch. I never had been. Now every time I close my eyes and hear the creaking of wood or the wind passing through the trees, I wonder if I'll ever really escape from what I found there in that dark basement. Something on the ranch is still waiting. My breathing stopped as I held the photo in my hands. The blurry figure standing in front of my window kept spinning in my mind. The unease grew in my chest until it became a knot. I thought about everything I had experienced since arriving at the ranch. The noises, the strange sensations, that constant feeling that something or someone was watching me. But until that moment, I hadn't had concrete proof that my fears were real. However, the photo wasn't the only thing in the box. To one side was a small diary, its cover worn by time. Upon opening it, I found pages full of handwritten notes in faded ink. The first pages talked about everyday things, about someone who had lived on the ranch years ago. But the last pages made my hair stand on end. Each word seemed more desperate than the last. I have felt that something follows me. I hear it at night in the walls on the ceiling. I have tried to leave the ranch, but something prevents me. It's here. It's inside. Reading those words, a feeling of cold ran down my back. There had been someone else before me who had experienced the same thing. What I felt, what I had heard during the night, wasn't something isolated, but part of a longer story, of something much deeper and older than myself. I couldn't continue reading. Panic filled me suddenly. I felt as if the house itself was breathing, waiting for me to read it to the end, as if I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. I got up quickly, left the diary on the table, and left the basement. Each step I took made me feel more trapped, as if the walls of the ranch were slowly closing around me. I ran to the main entrance looking for fresh air, looking to escape the feeling of claustrophobia that had taken hold of me. It was at that moment when I looked outside, toward the window from which I had seen the figure in the photo. My stomach twisted. The window was open. I hadn't left it open. I was sure I had closed it before going down to the basement. The wind was beginning to blow hard and the curtains moved slightly, as if something or someone was touching them. I couldn't stop staring. Part of me wanted to run and not look back, but another part, the one that couldn't avoid curiosity, pushed me to approach. Each step toward the window seemed slower to me, as if the air around me became denser, heavier. The feeling that something was watching me, waiting in the darkness, made me stop just before reaching it. The silence was unbearable. I could hear nothing but my accelerated breathing. Finally, with effort, I approached, took the handle, and closed it quickly. My pulse was accelerated and my hands were sweating. But when I looked again toward the field, something stopped me. In the distance, near the edge of the property, I saw a barely visible figure among the shadows, standing under a tree. I couldn't distinguish it clearly, but I could feel it watching me. The sight paralyzed me. As soon as the moonlight illuminated that figure a little more, I saw it move slowly, as if it were in no hurry. I don't know how long I spent watching, but when I reacted, the figure was no longer there. Just the empty field with the breeze, moving the tree branches. My mind couldn't process what I had just seen, but something told me I shouldn't stay any longer. Without thinking, I took the car keys and ran from the ranch. I needed to get away. It didn't matter where I went, I just knew I had to get out of there. I didn't know if what I had experienced was real or a product of my fear, but that sensation, that figure in the distance told me something wasn't right. I drove for hours without a fixed course, thinking of nothing but escape. I left behind the countryside, the trees, and the ranch. I needed to find a place where I could breathe peacefully. When I finally reached the nearest city, I stopped in front of a hotel and entered with the feeling that even though I was far away, something was still with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Fear remained in my chest, and the images of that figure under the tree haunted me. Even though I was in a closed room, the fear that something was waiting outside the walls kept me alert. Every noise, every shadow seemed to amplify the unease I felt. I decided to return to the ranch the next day, not because I wanted to, but because I felt I needed to face it, to put an end to all this. I had left behind many unanswered questions, and something inside me said that if I didn't return, I would never have peace. When I arrived again, the sun was beginning to set. The ranch seemed calm, but shadows were already lengthening across the terrain, creating a somber atmosphere that made me doubt my decision. Upon entering, I noticed that something had changed. The doors I had left closed were open, and I didn't remember leaving them that way. The windows, the same ones I had closed with such effort, were open, as if someone or something had entered. The noises, the footsteps, the whisper in the walls, everything was amplified in my head. As I toured the house, the weight of the place, the atmosphere became increasingly unbearable. I went to the attic once more, determined to face whatever was there, whatever was watching me. I climbed the stairs with a flashlight in hand. This time the basement seemed even darker, more ominous. I approached the small door to the storage room, and when I opened it, what I saw paralyzed me. It wasn't what I expected to find. The box I had found the first time was now completely empty. The photos, the diary, everything had disappeared. I looked around confused, not knowing what to think. But it was then that I noticed something on the storage room wall, a message scrawled with what looked like chalk or something similar. "You can no longer leave. We have seen you as they did before." Terror seized me at that moment. The words seemed to be written for me, as if they had been waiting for me. Something or someone had been watching me the whole time. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The feeling of being trapped, of being caught in a cycle, was what really terrified me. I couldn't escape from what I had discovered. Somehow, that place, that ranch, had chosen me. I couldn't leave. Something prevented me, something much deeper than any rational fear. And I knew it in that instant. It wasn't just about noises or shadows. It was about something that had been there long before I arrived, something that had already marked me, that had seen something in me that I didn't understand. I left the house with my heart pounding, not knowing if I could ever leave that ranch, if I would ever be free from what I had discovered. I only knew that place was no longer just a refuge, but a prison. And no matter how much I tried to flee, the feeling that something or someone was watching me would stay with me like a shadow that couldn't fade away. My name is James, and when I accepted the job at that ranch, I never imagined that what seemed to be a simple countryside employment would become an experience that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Almost a year ago, I desperately needed work. I had finished my studies, and after a few failed interviews, I found myself desperately searching for something that would help me get out of the stagnation I was in. That's when I saw the ad, "Ranch Assistant Wanted on City Outskirts, Housing Included." I didn't hesitate to call. The place was remote, a ranch located in the countryside about 2 hours by car from the city. It seemed like what I needed, to get away from the hustle and bustle, live quietly, work in the open air, all accompanied by the promise of a place to stay. I accepted without thinking much about it. The ranch owner, Don Manuel, was an older man with a deep gaze and grave voice. You could tell he had years of working in the countryside, and he explained that the ranch was dedicated to organic agriculture, though it also had a small livestock plot. The job he offered was varied: feeding the animals, maintaining the grounds, some gardening tasks, and occasionally chopping wood. Don Manuel lived in the main house, an old country mansion that had been restored and conditioned. But what caught my attention most was that he offered me to stay in a small cabin separate from the house, near the barn. The first few days were quiet. The cabin was isolated but cozy. It had the basics: a bed, a table, a rudimentary kitchen, and a small bathroom. I didn't complain. The tranquility of the countryside was comforting to me. The days passed slowly, and my work felt simple. Feeding the cows, cleaning the stables, watering the crops, and at the end of the day I could enjoy the peace of the place. However, it wasn't long before I started noticing strange things. At first, the changes were subtle, easy to ignore. Sometimes I found tools out of place, as if someone had been using my machete or work gloves without me seeing them. Other times the barn door was open, though I always made sure to close it when I finished my shift. I thought maybe I was the one forgetting to close them properly, or that the air current opened it, since the wind was quite strong in the afternoons. However, one afternoon, while watering one of the more distant plots, something happened that made me start doubting my assumptions. I returned to the cabin and found the main house door open. This surprised me because I knew Don Manuel always closed all doors well, and at that moment I hadn't seen him. I decided not to make much of it, thinking maybe he had gone out and forgotten to close the door behind him. But when I entered to leave him a note, I realized the house was empty. There was no trace of Don Manuel or anyone. In the kitchen, I found a half-empty coffee cup, as if someone had been there recently, but there were no signs of a person in the house. I felt uneasy. It could have been a simple coincidence, or maybe I was confused by the solitude of the place, but something in my instinct told me something wasn't right. That same night, after dinner, something even stranger happened. I was lying in bed when I heard noises coming from outside. At first I thought it was the wind, but the noises began to become more defined, as if someone was walking near my cabin. I thought maybe it was Don Manuel, who had gone out to check something on the property, so I got up and went out to the porch. But I saw no one, just the long shadows cast by moonlight and the sound of nature filling the air. The feeling that I wasn't alone persisted, but I decided that maybe it was just the isolation of the place and loneliness playing a trick on me. Despite those small incidents, I convinced myself that everything must have a logical explanation. But one afternoon, returning from a day's work, I found something I could no longer ignore. As I passed by the barn, I saw a figure in the back, near the shadows of the structure. At first I thought it was Don Manuel, but as I approached I realized it was a completely different figure. A person of thin build, dressed in work clothes, but with a hat that partially covered their face. When I called out, the figure disappeared into the darkness of the barn. My heart began to beat hard, and without thinking, I ran to the cabin, closed the door behind me, and didn't move from there until daylight faded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I had seen. The next day, I asked Don Manuel about that figure, but he seemed puzzled. "There's no one else on the ranch, James. I hired you to work here, and only you are on the property," he told me with a somewhat nervous smile. I tried not to give it more importance, but my mind kept dwelling on the idea that I wasn't alone in that place. The following days were a mixture of uncertainty and fear. Sometimes, when I returned to the cabin, I felt as if someone was watching me from the shadows, or I heard light footsteps behind me, as if there was another person following me in the field. The feeling of discomfort increased, but I couldn't do anything about it. Don Manuel didn't seem aware of anything strange, and I had no evidence to speak with him more seriously. The tranquility of the countryside had transformed into constant anxiety. The real turn occurred one rainy night when I decided to investigate on my own. I gathered courage and went out with a flashlight in hand, determined to find out what was happening. I walked down the path leading to the barn with my heart pounding in my chest. The rain was falling hard, and the sound of drops hitting the barn roof was almost deafening. When I reached the entrance, I felt the temperature had dropped suddenly. I ventured into the darkness of the barn, illuminating every corner with the flashlight. But what I found was much more puzzling than I had imagined. In the back, near some boxes and grain sacks, there was an old wooden chair. On it was a blanket. As I approached, I discovered that under the blanket was a small mattress, clearly used, and next to it several personal objects: a backpack, a pair of worn boots, and an almost empty water bottle. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone. Someone was living there, hidden on the ranch, without me knowing. I decided to confront Don Manuel the next day, but before doing so, I went to inspect the cabin to see if I found anything else. Upon entering, something made me stop. The work table was messy, and on it was a small notebook. Upon opening it, what I read left me speechless. Someone had been recording the ranch's movements. They noted the times I woke up, the work I did, and even the times I went to town. Everything was recorded with disturbing precision, as if that person was observing each of my movements. When I showed all this to Don Manuel, his expression changed. He remained silent for a long time, as if processing what I was telling him. Finally, he sighed and sank into the chair. "James, there's something you should know," he began in a grave tone. "Many years ago, when I bought this ranch, there was a family that lived on the property before me. But not everything was normal. There was a man, a worker who helped in the field, but he began to behave strangely. No one knew where he came from or who he really was. One day he disappeared. We never knew what happened to him, but I always felt something wasn't right. Maybe that person never left. At that moment, I understood there was something much darker on that ranch than I had imagined. My mind began to spin, and a feeling of terror took hold of me. Who was living in that barn? Why hadn't anyone told me anything before? And what would happen if that person decided to confront me? Don Manuel looked at me intently, as if he knew what I was thinking. "James," he said in a low voice, "there are things that sometimes it's better not to know. If you leave now, I would recommend it, but if you decide to stay, prepare for whatever is here." In the end, I made the decision to leave. Despite needing work, I couldn't stay in that place. The ranch, which had initially seemed like a refuge of peace, had become a place full of darkness and mystery. Somehow I felt I wasn't the only one living there, and I wasn't willing to continue being part of a story I didn't understand. I left the ranch, and although work called me later, I never returned. And what torments me most is thinking that somehow I'm still leaving something behind in that place, something that doesn't go with the wind, but remains watching in the darkness. After leaving the ranch, I thought the most sensible thing was to return to the city, get away from everything that had happened, and try to return to a normal life. However, the unease persisted in my mind like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I couldn't get out of my head the figure that had been living in the barn, the person who had been watching me, without me realizing who that person really was, and why no one had told me about it. The feeling of being pursued didn't leave me, and at night sometimes I felt someone was watching me from the shadows of my room. At first, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination or fear, accumulated from the solitude of the countryside. Maybe I had been too stressed or simply let my mind play tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself there was something real, something I didn't fully understand that had been surrounding me from the moment I arrived at the ranch. During the weeks following my departure, I returned to city routine, looking for work elsewhere, trying to regain control of my life. However, every time I found myself in an open space or quiet environment, the feeling that someone was nearby invaded me again. I felt that person who had lived on the ranch, that presence I couldn't understand, somehow followed me. One afternoon, about 3 months after leaving the ranch, I received a call that made me think again about everything I had experienced there. It was an unknown number, but I didn't hesitate to answer. "Hello, who's speaking?" I responded, trying to hide the tension in my voice. The voice that answered wasn't Don Manuel's. It was a man, but sounded young, almost like someone my age. The tone of his voice was serious, but also somewhat worried. "James, I'm Ernesto, Don Manuel's nephew. I need to talk to you. Can you come? It's urgent." At first, I didn't understand well what he was asking of me. Why was he calling me? What could Don Manuel or his nephew need? I had made it clear that I had left, that I no longer wanted to know anything about the place. But Ernesto's tone, that kind of urgency in his voice, made me feel I should listen to what he had to say. Although I felt growing discomfort, I accepted. The next morning, I took the car and headed toward the ranch again. This time, I didn't have the same feeling of freedom as the first time, nor the same enthusiasm for being in the countryside. The road seemed longer to me, and as I approached the ranch, an oppression in my chest became stronger and stronger. When I arrived, I saw Ernesto waiting at the entrance. He was a tall man with dark, short hair and a tired expression. He didn't look like I remembered him, like someone calm and relaxed. He seemed altered, as if something was weighing on him. "Thanks for coming, James," he said almost without greeting me as he guided me toward the house. "I don't know how to begin explaining what's happening, but I need you to listen to me." I followed him into the house, and upon entering I felt as if time had stopped. The house remained the same dark, with wooden furniture, but the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. Despite being daytime, the lights remained on, and a strange sensation invaded me. Everything seemed to be in its place, but something wasn't right. "What's happening, Ernesto?" I asked, unable to hide my nervousness. Ernesto led me to the living room, where he sat in an armchair, leaving me standing in front of him. It seemed the words didn't come easily to him, and his gaze kept moving toward the windows, as if he feared someone was watching us. "What I'm going to tell you is complicated," he began. "Since you left, something strange has been happening on the ranch. My uncle, Don Manuel, has been acting weird. Sometimes he spends days without talking to anyone, but the worst thing is we found things in the barn, on the property. The presence of someone, I don't know how to explain it, but it's as if someone is there, living on the ranch without us seeing them. My mind began to process what he was saying. Was it possible that person was still on the ranch? I had made it clear I felt uncomfortable, but I never imagined the presence of that person who had been living in the barn could persist even after my departure. What kind of things? I asked almost in a whisper, fear taking hold of me again. Ernesto breathed deeply, as if searching for the right words. We found personal objects in the barn, the same ones you saw when you were here, he said. But the worst thing is that at night, we hear strange noises, doors that open and close by themselves, footsteps in the hallway, whispers. We don't know if it's a stranger who continues living here or if something else is happening. A chill ran down my back. The same things I had experienced when working there, the same sensations of being watched, now seemed to be affecting Ernesto and his family. But what disturbed me most was the mention of whispers. I well remembered those moments when I woke up in the cabin with the feeling that someone was watching me, and how voices seemed to come from somewhere on the ranch. Don Manuel, does he know about this? I asked, trying to understand the situation. Ernesto nodded slowly. Yes, but he doesn't want to talk about it. Every time I ask him, he tells me it's better to leave it alone. But I know something strange is happening here. I don't want this to continue affecting us. I need to know what happened when you worked here. Who was on that ranch? Was it really just an accident, as my uncle said? His question left me speechless. I had been trying to evade the topic, not wanting to think about what had happened. The disappearance of the person who had been living in the barn, the strange events, the feelings of discomfort. Everything led me back to a dark place I didn't want to remember. But now I felt I should tell him what I knew. I don't know what happened, Ernesto. When I was there, I felt someone else was on the ranch. I saw a figure in the barn, someone moving among the shadows. Don Manuel never spoke to me about this, but there's something I don't understand. I also saw strange things, and what you're telling me doesn't surprise me, but I don't know what's happening here. Ernesto looked at me intently, as if searching for something in my eyes. I need you to help me, James. If you can't tell me what happened, at least tell me how I can stop this. I can't continue living with this feeling that we're not alone here. A feeling of desperation invaded me, and for the first time I realized the ranch was no longer a place where people could live peacefully. Something else, something we couldn't understand, was in that place. And although my mind asked me to flee, I felt I should help Ernesto, not for them, but for myself. I needed to understand what had been happening. That night I decided to stay on the ranch with Ernesto to find out what was happening. We gathered courage and began checking every corner, every shadow where darkness seemed to hide. The whispers began again, louder, as if they were calling us. And when we entered the barn, something was waiting for us. We weren't the only ones on that ranch. And the worst thing is that now we knew we had never been alone. My name is Jake, and I'm 34 years old. This testimony I'm going to share happened 3 years ago, in 2022, when I had just moved to a small town in New Mexico. I set up a small taco restaurant right in a very busy area, close to a highway where lots of people pass by, buses, patrol cars, everything. But just past that highway on the other side, there's a small ravine, somewhat deep, but full of thick undergrowth, bushes, and trees. From the moment I arrived, several neighbors told me, "Don't stay too late, young man. Little people appear in that ravine." I laughed, thinking, little people, that's for fairy tales, not for someone who works 12 hours standing up. But within a few days, strange things started happening. Every night before leaving, I'd clean everything. I'd leave each thing in its place. The salt shaker, the spoons, the napkin holders, the bottles, everything. I'm very organized because that's how my old boss taught me. But the next day when I arrived, I'd find everything moved. The salt shaker would appear far away, the napkin holders thrown around, the spoons outside their container, small things, as if they'd been tossed around or played with. I foolishly thought it was the wind or some cat, but there was no way one could get in. This happened to me for 6 nights in a row. I'd find everything scattered. The neighbors told me it was the little people, that they were very mischievous. I didn't believe it until I decided to sleep there one night. I closed around 1:30 in the morning. I put everything away, made myself comfortable on the floor, and between the exhaustion and the light rain that was falling, I fell asleep around 2:30. I woke up at 7:30 in the morning, but once again everything was scattered. I hadn't realized it. I didn't even hear anything, not even the spoons hitting the floor. And I'm not a heavy sleeper. I started picking everything up, somewhat annoyed, but there was something else. It had been drizzling the night before, and right on the floor there were several mud stains from small feet, human, but tiny. That's when I went quiet. I didn't know whether to keep laughing or listen to the neighbors. That night I decided to stay later with the restaurant open. It was Saturday, and there was good customer flow. My last customers left around 2:20, 2:30 in the morning. I started putting things away calmly without making much noise, and then I saw it. While I was sweeping in front of the restaurant, I looked toward the ravine, and I swear I saw several small figures walking in the undergrowth. Tiny people, they weren't children, they looked like elderly folks. They didn't make noise, they had human shapes. Some were going down through the undergrowth. Others simply vanished among the bushes. I was frozen. They didn't scare me, but they left me thinking. Since that night I believe, and now every day I leave sunflower seeds near the restaurant. As many neighbors recommended, sometimes they're intact in the morning, other times they disappear. But since I started doing it, my things no longer end up scattered. My name is Saul Estrada. I've been a forest ranger for almost 16 years, and I'm currently assigned to Glacier National Park in Montana. For many, this park is one of the best-kept secrets in the western United States. Low mists that seep between trees, giant peaks with names like Bear Mountain or Eagle's Rest, and trails that seem invented by fairy tales. But you don't take care of a forest for so long without realizing it also keeps dark things. My job is almost always the same. Patrol authorized trails, check that visitors don't make fires in prohibited areas, ensure no one takes plants or animals, and sometimes rescue hikers who stray from the path. Since the pandemic, there have been more people in the mountains, but also more carelessness, more trash, and to tell the truth, more accidents. What I'm going to tell you happened to me in October of last year, right in the low season, when the park empties during weekdays and the only ones roaming around are us conservation folks, biologists, and the occasional crazy loner who wants to connect with nature. It was Tuesday. I remember well because that day I went out alone to check the old Grizzly Point Trail, a route that leads to the viewpoint, but was closed years ago due to rock slides. Even so, from time to time, we find people who ignore the signs and go in there, so you have to walk it occasionally. Everything was going normal. The day was cool, with that thin mist that filters through the pines. I was walking with my radio, my field notebook, a water bottle, and the machete hanging from my belt as always. It was then, passing a sharp curve near an old oak, a huge one with exposed roots like giant fingers, that something caught my attention. To the right of the trail, right where a descent begins, I noticed the earth was disturbed. It wasn't a burrow or a rock fall. It was a space of loose earth, as if someone had dug and then covered hastily. I approached carefully. Something didn't feel right. I scraped a little with the machete, just a few centimeters. It was enough. There, half buried, was an arm, a human arm already pale, with decomposed skin and still with a black plastic bracelet on the wrist. I didn't scream. You don't scream when you find that. Your voice goes away. I backed away immediately and radioed the base. No one answered. It wasn't rare in those areas radio signal fails. So I took my cell phone, climbed a few meters to get signal, and called directly to one of my trusted colleagues, Tony, another ranger who also had years of experience. I told him the basics. He told me to wait there, not to touch anything else. I stayed still for almost half an hour, but Tony didn't arrive. Who arrived was another guy, a man I didn't know, park uniform, but without the badge or identification number. He came down the same trail, as if he knew exactly where to go. "Are you Estrada?" he asked me without introducing himself. "Yes, who told you?" "Tony sent me from coordination. There are protocols for this. Better you don't say anything to anyone. We'll take care of it." It sounded wrong from the first moment. "Aren't you going to call the police?" He looked at me for a long time. His answer was dry. "It's not necessary. There's already knowledge of the case. It was just bad luck you found it." That set off my alarms. I told him it was mandatory to file a report and notify the district attorney as procedures indicate. He answered me almost without emotion. "Don't do it, Saul. It's convenient for you." That's where I knew something was very wrong. That night I didn't sleep. I went home to town, pretending normalcy. But as soon as daylight faded, I kept thinking about the arm, the disturbed earth, and the empty look of that guy who arrived before anyone. I didn't want to call Tony. Inside, I already felt him implicated. I decided to do something I would later question many times. I returned to the site the next day without notice. I took another less direct route, one I knew well since I was young, and we went camping in the canyons. I reached the oak past noon. The site was no longer the same. The earth had been covered with a layer of fallen leaves. Someone had removed the traces and placed a restricted access tape hanging between two branches, but nothing official. There were no investigation marks, no forensic survey, nothing indicating authorities had been there. That confirmed to me they didn't want the discovery to be known. But the worst was yet to come. That night around 11:30, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered. No one spoke, just a brief silence, and then a very low, masculine voice that said, "We're taking care of you, Saul. Don't ruin that." I hung up. My hands were shaking. I made sure to close doors and windows well. I don't have family. I live alone, so if something happened to me, no one would know soon. I asked myself 1,000 times why I didn't call the police, why I didn't report the discovery to some media. But the truth is I was afraid. It wasn't just any fear. It was a fear installed in my neck, as if I knew something bigger was moving behind that. During the following days, I pretended nothing was happening. I returned to patrolling, filling daily reports, greeting visitors who went into the paths, but I paid better attention to faces. I realized something that made my body crawl. There were at least 3 more people with forest ranger uniforms who didn't belong to the park's real staff. They never talked much, moved alone, and didn't do rounds, they just watched. One afternoon, I ran into one at the old viewpoint booth. He was smoking alone, looking toward the forest. I approached carefully. "Are you at Mineral Base or Whitefish?" He looked at me, took a long drag. "I'm not from either." "Then who sends you?" "You already know the answer, don't you?" That was all he said. He left. Almost a week later, an envelope arrived at my door. It had no return address. Inside was a printed photo. It was the bracelet from the arm I had seen, on a table. Next to it, a manila folder with black letters that said Case 1283B, Definitive Closure. Below that, a handwritten note. "You weren't looking for it, don't forget it." I no longer knew what I was involved in. In secret, I talked to a contact I have in emergency management, someone who once helped me report illegal construction in a protected area. I asked him to investigate if there were reports of recent disappearances in the area. He called me back in 2 days. "Saul, I'm passing this to you in confidence. 4 months ago, a guy from Seattle disappeared who came camping in the park. Nothing was ever known. His cell phone gave the last signal in the Grizzly Point area, but officially they said he had left toward Kalispell. And the family, they insisted at first, then they also disappeared from the process. The case was closed." He sent me the name, Louis Adrian M., 26 years old. I looked for the photo on social media. When I found it, I felt blood drain to the floor. The guy was wearing the same black bracelet on his wrist that I saw that morning. I don't know who killed him. I don't know if it was an accident, a settlement, or something else. But I do know whoever did it doesn't want it known. And that there are people in the park with false uniforms, false names, who take care of erasing traces. I decided to talk to a local journalist. I told him the basics, gave him copies of everything. I told him I couldn't get directly involved, that the only thing I wanted was, if something happened to me, someone would know why. I never returned to the Oak, but since then, every time I go out to patrol, I make sure if they follow me. And I never use the same route 2 days in a row. What I found that morning wasn't an accident. It was a buried message. And every day that passes, I'm more convinced the forest didn't want to hide it. It was just waiting for someone to find it. Several weeks passed in which everything seemed to calm down. The journalist I had spoken with, a guy named Manuel Salinas, sent me a couple of messages saying he was reviewing everything, that he needed time to verify the data. He asked me not to look for him through other means, that he would contact me. I believed him more out of necessity than confidence. I continued with my rounds in the park pretending normalcy, but I began to notice subtle changes. The routes that were previously assigned to other colleagues began to be assigned to me. Distant routes, areas that hadn't been covered in years, with supposed reports of trash or fallen branches, uninhabited places, where signal doesn't reach and you're left alone among the trees. One afternoon, they sent me to the North Sector, near Wolverine Caves, to check a report of abandoned camping. I found nothing, but when I returned to base, one of the area chiefs, who until then had never addressed me beyond formalities, called me aside. "Hey, Saul, I got a weird notice. Someone reported you were snooping in restricted areas. Everything okay?" I stayed quiet. I told him I didn't know what he was referring to. He just looked at me and patted my shoulder. "Just don't get involved where you're not called. Look, the mountains keep things we sometimes don't know how to explain." That phrase hasn't left me. A couple of nights later, around 3 in the morning, I heard a noise outside my house. I live on the outskirts of the town of West Glacier, where streets are gravel and dogs alert to any movement. But that night, no dog barked. I went out with a lamp and saw a figure walking away among shadows without running, without hurrying. I didn't recognize it. The next morning, I found an envelope on my truck's windshield. Inside was a single sheet folded in 4. It was an enlarged copy of an official park ranger log. I recognized the format immediately. Officer name, assigned route, observations. But what was underlined with red marker made a knot in my stomach. Internal log 030722. Oak Canyon area. Observation, body recovery completed. External personnel present. Point relocated. Access closed for the moment. Signature B coordination. Confirmation SC. Those initials were mine. S. Saul Estrada. I had never signed anything. That was what disturbed me most. Someone was involving me as if they wanted that if something went wrong, it would look like I was part of it. It was no longer just about a discovery. It was a warning, a way of telling me, you're already inside, whether you know it or not. I thought about leaving, resigning, moving, but at 45, with years of public service, without direct family, where was I going to go? Who was going to believe me without concrete evidence? And besides, I couldn't let this go without knowing what had really happened to that young man, Louis Adrian. It was then that Manuel, the journalist, contacted me again. He arranged to meet me at a cafe in Kalispell in a discreet place. He arrived with a folder and a face I didn't like at all. "I need you to see this," he told me without greeting. He showed me a series of aerial photographs taken from a drone, according to his explanation, all from the area where I found the arm. In one of them, dated a few days after the discovery, you could see a clear excavation about 6 feet long with 2 human figures beside it, neither with visible uniforms. In another, later one, the hole was already covered, but what made me frown was what was marked in red in one of the corners. A white van without plates, with a long antenna mounted on the roof. That vehicle was tracked entering and leaving the park at least 3 times, all between midnight and 4 in the morning, Manuel said. It was never registered at the booth, and there's no official report of technical visit. And what do you think they're doing? He looked at me seriously, more tired than anything. I don't know yet, but they're covering something up, and it's not the first time. He told me he had been investigating unreported disappearances in protected natural areas for 2 years, places where people get lost without a trace, and then the case closes for lack of evidence. And that on more than one occasion. Indirect witnesses like me had reported finding remains, but ended up fired, silenced, or disappeared. He left me a copy of everything he had and asked us to stay in careful contact. Nothing through networks, just coded calls or messages written on paper. I told him yes, but deep down I felt something was going to break soon. I wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, at mid-morning, an official vehicle arrived at the park. It wasn't from the Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife. It said Federal Environmental Surveillance, but it wasn't a common patrol. 2 men in suits with dark glasses got out, accompanied by a guy in olive green uniform I didn't recognize. They asked to speak with me, took me to the administrative office, and interrogated me for almost an hour. Vague, repeated questions. Had I reported strange discoveries? Who had I talked to? Why did I return to the closed trail? They didn't accuse me, but they made it clear they knew everything. At one point, one of them said, "Sometimes excess curiosity complicates things, Estrada, and in this country people disappear for less." I didn't know if it was a threat or advice. When they left, they placed a letter in my internal file, a supposed warning for noncompliance with security protocols. Nothing more. But with that, they could fire me if they felt like it. Today it's been almost 5 months since all that. I continue working in the park, but they changed my area. I no longer patrol alone. There's always someone else, some new guy, always in training, who accompanies me. Most don't talk much, and I know they're not novices. The journalist Manuel stopped answering me 2 weeks ago. His last call was brief. He told me, "I'm going to publish something, but if something happens to me, make sure someone has what I gave you." I haven't heard from him again. Sometimes I think about the arm, the bracelet, the earth that seemed freshly disturbed, and I can't help feeling I'm standing on an invisible line where what's on this side is the park, as everyone sees it beautiful, calm, full of life. And on the other side, a network of buried secrets, carefully maintained by people with power. I don't know how much longer I can live in the middle, but I know something. If tomorrow I disappear, it wasn't because I got lost in the forest. It was because I found something the earth no longer wanted to swallow. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.